Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're tracing the contours of a memory so ancient it has nearly dissolved into myth yet remains etched into the land itself. We're exploring what happens when civilization pushes against limits it cannot see until they break, when power concentrates beyond wisdom's reach, and when a single moment of miscalculation rewrites the future for generations uncounted. What was this place before the sky turned against it? Why does the earth there still refuse to yield life, centuries after the fires cooled? How did a catastrophe so complete that it erased cities, poisoned valleys, and scattered populations become encoded not as history but as warning, a story told in fragments across cultures, preserved not in triumph but in dread? We'll explore where this tale begins. Buried in the oldest clay tablets humanity ever pressed, we'll trace how memory transforms catastrophe into mythology, when the truth becomes too dangerous to speak plainly. And we'll follow the long shadow this event cast across every civilization that came after, shaping law, religion, and the very structure of restraint. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to drift into sleep, or to follow these currents of forgotten consequence, I'm glad you're with me. Now let's begin. Long before any scripture was set into permanence, before temples rose to codify the divine, there existed a morning when the sky itself seemed to fracture above a fertile plain. The air that day carried no warning, only the scent of irrigated fields and the distant bleating of flocks moving toward water. Then light arrived, not gradually as dawn does, but all at once, a brilliance that erased shadow and left only heat. The valley once known as the Kikar was not always a wound in the earth. Centuries before that morning, this low basin near the Jordan River was a place of abundance. Streams braided through green fields. Palms cast long shadows over irrigation channels dug with the kind of care that suggests generations of accumulated knowledge. Trade routes converged here where caravans rested before crossing harsher lands to the south and east. It was terrain that shaped power quietly, because whoever controlled these fertile corridors controlled movement, food, and time itself. Stand at the southern edge of what is now called the Dead Sea, and you feel something wrong in the air. The heat presses downward with unusual weight. The silence is not peaceful but oppressive, as though sound itself struggles to travel. The water lies still and heavy, dense with salt that crusts the shoreline like frost that never melts. Nothing swims in those depths. No birds fish its surface. Even the wind, when it comes, carries a faint bitterness that settles on the tongue. This was not always so. Ancient accounts describe the region as resembling the garden of the Lord, not mythic perfection but careful cultivation, ordered water, predictable harvests, soil dark and rich enough to yield twice in a single year when rain came as expected. 5 cities rose here, their names preserved because their end came suddenly enough to freeze them in memory: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. When destruction comes slowly, it erases names first. When it arrives all at once, names remain like labels carved into bone. The cities were bound not only by geography but by shared infrastructure. Water systems connected them. Merchant houses maintained agents in multiple locations. Marriages linked ruling families. This was not a loose confederation but an integrated economic zone, prosperous enough to attract attention, strategically positioned enough to matter in conflicts it might not have fully understood. Even in antiquity, travelers approaching this region noted its strangeness. It sat at the lowest exposed point on land, pulled downward as if by forces beneath the surface. In ancient thought, low places carried associations with judgment and confinement, not from superstition, but because floods, fumes, and disease naturally gathered in valleys. Yet this basin had not flooded into fertility. Something had happened here that reversed the normal order. The land had collapsed into sterility. The morning everything changed began like any other. Smoke rose from cooking fires as bread was set to bake. The smell of barley porridge and roasting lamb drifted through narrow streets. Children carried water jars toward the wells. Merchants argued over the weight of copper ingots and the quality of dyed cloth. The air was warm but not yet oppressive, the kind of heat that arrives before midday and sends people seeking shade. Then 2 figures appeared at the city gate. The story of their arrival has been told and retold until it feels distant, symbolic, scrubbed clean of the specific fear that must have accompanied it. But strip away the theological overlay, and a pattern emerges. These were not wandering philosophers or lost traders. They moved with authority. They unsettled those who saw them. In the ancient Near East, such figures were called messengers, not beings with wings and halos, but carriers of command. Their presence usually preceded change, rarely comfort. Lot's reaction was immediate. He rose from where he sat at the gate and bowed low, insisting they shelter in his house. This was not mere courtesy. Hospitality in the desert world was survival law, a contract older than kings. To refuse shelter was to invite blood feuds and divine consequence alike: water for feet, bread for strength, shade for the night. These gestures formed a boundary that held fragile societies together when law and custom alone could not. That contract is why what happened next felt so catastrophic. The crowd that gathered did not merely threaten strangers. It violated the one rule that kept order from collapsing into chaos. The text preserves this moment with disturbing directness, as if insisting that whatever comes after cannot be separated from what the city had become. Inside the house, urgency replaced negotiation. There was no debate, no attempt at reform, no warning issued to the city as a whole. The command was immediate: evacuation. Anyone connected by blood or allegiance was to be removed at once. The instruction not to linger in the plain was repeated with unusual force, as though remaining at low altitude would be fatal regardless of moral standing. The landscape itself had suddenly become hostile, not spiritually, but physically. Dawn came, and with it the end of everything. What followed was not fire as humans understood it. This was not the gradual spread of flame through timber and thatch the kind shepherds used to clear brush or potters used to harden clay. This was instantaneous conversion of matter. Stone deformed, sand liquefied, organic material ceased to exist as structure. The heat exceeded anything generated by conventional combustion, arriving not as progression but as presence, total, immediate. Accounts across cultures describe it as light too intense to bear, a false sun rising from the ground itself, light so bright it erased shadow, so hot it seared vision even through closed eyelids. This was not illumination. It was annihilation of darkness through sheer force. Then the heat temperature that did not rise but appeared, complete and overwhelming. Walls that had stood for generations softened and slumped. Bronze vessels melted where they stood. Pottery vitrified, their outer surfaces transforming into glass while interiors remained clay. This kind of transformation requires temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees, sustained for long enough to penetrate material, but brief enough to leave structure partially intact. No Bronze Age technology could produce such heat in open air. The shock wave followed, a wall of compressed air moving faster than sound. It struck not like wind but like a solid object, pulverizing whatever remained standing. Walls collapsed outward, not inward, pushed by pressure from above and within simultaneously. Debris scattered in patterns that would later confuse excavators until physics explained them. Human remains, when found, were fragmented beyond recognition, scattered across destruction layers, sometimes fused with surrounding material. Then came the column. Smoke, dust, vaporized minerals, and chemical residue climbed vertically, forming a plume so massive and so hot that it created its own weather. The image was captured by distant witnesses, smoke rising like that of a furnace, thick and dark, climbing straight up before spreading at altitude like a tree whose branches reach in all directions. Ancient observers lacked terms like convection column, but their metaphors were precise enough to recognize the phenomenon centuries later. From a ridge far enough away to survive, Abraham watched. The text notes his position with geographic specificity, east of the cities, elevated, at a distance measured in hours of travel on foot. What he saw was not flames licking rooftops but transformation of the atmosphere itself. The air became opaque. The light turned strange, and the smell sulfur mixed with burning organic matter, a stench that would cling to clothing and memory alike. The fate of Lot's wife remains one of the most haunting images in ancient literature, precisely because it resists easy symbolism. She does not die by fire or blade. She becomes something else. The language describes her turning into a pillar of salt, not metaphorically but materially. In this region, salt is not merely a mineral. It is death to soil. Fields oversaturated with it turn white and hard, rejecting seeds year after year. To become salt is to become a permanent marker of exclusion from life. Whether this describes literal mineralization, a body encased in crystallized fallout, or something the witnesses lacked language to explain accurately, the image conveys a single truth. The boundary was crossed too late. Proximity killed not through flame but through transformation. Whatever lingered in that zone did not burn, it changed state. For hours after the initial event, the wind carried particles too small to see. They settled into soil and water. They infiltrated fields miles from the blast center. Crops that survived the heat withered within days. Animals that drank from contaminated streams sickened and died. This was not immediate death, but delayed consequence. The kind ancient peoples called a curse because they lacked vocabulary for contamination. The aftermath was silence, not the peaceful quiet of evening, but the unnatural absence of life. No insects hummed. No birds called. Even the wind, when it returned, made no sound against structures that no longer stood. Survivors who approached from safe distances found not ruins to salvage, but landscapes emptied of possibility. Stones too hot to touch, ground cracked and dry despite recent irrigation, and everywhere the smell sulfur and char and something else, something that clung to the back of the throat and would not wash away. This was not conquest. Conquest leaves survivors to be enslaved, structures to be repurposed, fields to be claimed. This was sterilization, the deliberate or accidental elimination of life itself. The difference matters. Armies can be resisted, sieges can be endured, defeats can be reversed. But when land itself becomes uninhabitable, survival requires abandonment. Archaeological surveys conducted centuries later found something peculiar. The fertile plain showed long gaps in habitation, not gradual decline but sudden cessation. Settlements that had thrived for generations simply ended. The next layer of occupation, when it appeared at all, showed different pottery styles, different architectural techniques, different populations. The original inhabitants did not return. Their descendants, if any survived, settled elsewhere. They did not reclaim what their ancestors had built. This pattern of abandonment without return is unusual. Humans are persistent. They rebuild after earthquakes, floods, and wars. They return to river valleys that flood regularly because fertility outweighs risk. They reconstruct cities destroyed by enemies because location retains strategic value. But here, in this basin, return did not happen. Memory of danger outlasted memory of prosperity. Something else appears in the destruction layer at sites identified with these cities. Microscopic spherules, tiny droplets of iron and silica formed when material vaporizes and then cools rapidly while airborne. These spherules do not form in ordinary fires or earthquakes. They require sudden extreme heat and violent dispersion into the atmosphere. They are known from meteor impacts and nuclear detonations. Their presence here indicates energy release on a scale beyond anything Bronze Age humanity could generate. More telling still is the presence of shocked quartz sand grains bearing microscopic fractures that occur only under immense instantaneous pressure, forces measured in gigapascals. Such pressure cannot result from tectonic activity or human construction. It points to either cosmic impact or high-energy explosion. Either scenario aligns with ancient descriptions of fire from heaven better than any conventional disaster. The land remembers. Salt concentrations remain anomalously high. Soil chemistry shows contamination that persists across millennia. Water sources in the region carry mineral loads that make agriculture difficult even now. Since are not poetic details. They are measurable consequences of an event that altered the environment. When later cultures encountered this region, they told stories. The stories varied in detail but converged on key points. Cities existed here once. They were destroyed suddenly. The land became cursed. No one should settle it. These warnings were not abstract moral lessons. They were practical advice based on observed reality. The ground does not lie, fields that will not grow cannot be argued with, water that sickens livestock does not respond to prayer. Over time the mechanism was forgotten but the warning persisted. What had been a specific disaster became a general principle. Certain boundaries must not be crossed, certain places must not be entered. Certain kinds of power, once unleashed, leave scars that do not heal. The catastrophe at the cities of the plain was not an isolated event but a chapter in a much older conflict, one that began long before humans built cities, and long before the Jordan Valley became fertile. To understand why such destruction might have been deemed necessary, we must step backward, beyond the valley, beyond even the earliest texts that preserved its memory, into a world where power was concentrated in hands that were not entirely human. The Sumerian tablets, pressed into damp clay 5,000 years ago, speak of this older order with unsettling directness. They do not present mythology in the sense of invented stories meant to explain natural phenomena. Default. They read more like administrative records, detailing events, relationships and hierarchies with the matter-of-fact tone of bureaucrats cataloging reality. In these texts appear the Anunnaki, a term that translates as those who came from heaven to earth. This phrase is often dismissed as poetic or symbolic, but in its original context it functions more like a job description. These beings are described as rulers, judges, engineers, and overseers. They assign tasks, distribute resources, enforce hierarchy. They argue, plot, and punish. They are not omnipresent or omniscient. They move from place to place, establish centers of operation, and occasionally make catastrophic errors in judgment. They possess overwhelming power, but not infinite wisdom. Sumerian kingship itself was said to descend from these beings. This did not mean divine right in an abstract sense, but delegation of authority from a functional hierarchy. Kings ruled because they were appointed, instructed, and monitored. The earliest law codes read less like philosophy and more like operational manuals. Do this, avoid that. The consequence for deviation is specified. Civilization in this framework was not discovered gradually through human trial and error. It was installed, taught, imposed. Among these beings, two names recur with particular intensity: Enlil and Enki. Enlil is associated with command. The word often translated as wind in his name does not mean breeze but force, the invisible pressure that moves things whether they consent or not. Enlil's domain is structure and control. He enforces boundaries and punishes overreach. Enki, by contrast, is linked to water, depth, and cunning. His wisdom is practical, experimental, adaptive. Where Enlil issues orders, Enki finds solutions, often through means that bend or circumvent direct commands. This tension between rigid authority and flexible problem-solving shapes every major event in Sumerian memory. Even creation itself is described not as a miracle, but as a labor problem. The lower-ranking Anunnaki, the Igigi, are exhausted from maintaining infrastructure. They mine, dig, and build without rest. Eventually they rebel. The response is not punishment but innovation. Enki proposes creating a new worker by modifying a creature already present on Earth. The language resembles mixing, binding, imprinting terms that suggest biological manipulation rather than mystical conjuring. Humanity enters the record not as the crown of creation, but as a solution to a logistical challenge. The Sumerian word, often translated as man in these passages, carries the connotation of laborer or worker. Humans are designed to bear burdens, to free their creators from repetitive tasks. This does not strip humanity of value, it gives it function. To be useful is to be necessary. Necessity implies intent. Once established, humans multiply rapidly. Their noise becomes a problem. In ancient texts, noise does not refer merely to sound but to disruption, unpredictability, autonomy. Enlil grows hostile to this proliferation. Enki remains protective of his creation. This disagreement culminates in the flood, another event that appears in multiple cultures with striking consistency. Enlil chooses eradication. Enki circumvents it by warning one loyal human to build a vessel and survive. Preservation depends on allegiance, not virtue. This pattern matters because it reframes later destruction. When cities are eliminated, it is not because humanity is inherently corrupt but because alliances shift and loyalty falters. To align with the wrong authority is to invite annihilation. Sin, in this framework, is less moral failure than political betrayal. As time passes, the Anunnaki do not remain united. Generational tensions emerge. Those born on Earth feel differently about this planet than those who arrived from elsewhere. Among the second generation, one figure stands apart: Marduk, son of Enki. He is not content with a subordinate role. He understands humans not as tools but as a power base. Where others demand obedience, he offers favor, protection, advancement. Marduk chooses Babylon as his center, a city positioned at the crossroads of rivers and trade routes. From there he teaches astronomy, calendar systems, ritual order. These are not spiritual gifts in the abstract. They are technologies of prediction and coordination. To control time is to control agriculture, taxation, warfare. To organize rituals is to organize loyalty. Marduk's rise is quiet but relentless. He does not overthrow openly. He accumulates influence until displacement becomes inevitable. To Enlil and his son Ninurta, this is intolerable. Ninurta is the enforcer, associated with weapons and campaigns. He is celebrated in hymns as a hero who crushes mountains and enemies alike. His violence is not chaotic. It is precise, surgical, overwhelming. He exists to restore order when it is threatened by force too great for negotiation. The world at this point becomes a chessboard. Cities align themselves not only with economic partners but with divine patrons. Geography acquires strategic meaning beyond trade. The fertile plain near the Jordan is no longer just productive land. It is a corridor leading toward the Sinai Peninsula, a region described in texts as a bond between heaven and earth, a place of ascent and descent. If such a facility existed for communication or transport, it would require protection. Buffer zones would be established. Loyal settlements would guard approaches. In this light, the cities of the plain were not peripheral, they were forward positions. Their allegiance mattered strategically. When messengers arrived to inspect them, they were not tourists or wandering prophets. They were auditors assessing loyalty. Their withdrawal of a single family suggests targeted extraction retrieval of an asset before the site is neutralized. Once assets are secured, elimination follows. The scale of destruction reflects urgency, perhaps panic. Conventional siege or conquest would be insufficient and too slow. Something final is chosen, something that leaves no possibility of recovery or reuse by rivals. In Sumerian language, the weapons used in such conflicts are described as winds, storms, and radiance, terms that blend natural force with deliberate intent. The evil wind that follows initial strikes is not immediate death but lingering consequence. A cloud that moves, settles, sickens. Animals die, plants wither, water becomes undrinkable. This is not poetic embellishment. This is accurate observation of effects we now associate with radioactive fallout or chemical contamination. Here the stories of the valley and of Sumer intersect. The same aftermath appears in both sudden destruction, land abandonment, poisoned water, delayed death among survivors, the same insistence on distance, on not remaining, on not looking back. These are not moral commands framed as divine law. They are survival instructions issued by those who understood the danger, even if they could not explain its mechanism. When later civilizations inherit fragments of these accounts, they strip away technical context and preserve only the warning. Fire becomes judgment, smoke becomes sign of divine wrath, but beneath the theological frame, the memory of technology remains distorted, compressed, mythologized, but persistent. The destruction of the cities of the plain was not an isolated act of supernatural anger. It was a maneuver in a conflict that reshaped the hierarchy of power across the ancient world. Once such force is used, it cannot be unlearned. Those who witness it carry the knowledge forward in silence, encoding it into lore and taboo. Those who come after inherit only stories, and stories over time become scripture, yet the land itself continues to testify. Let sterile soil as an argument no myth can erase. When power fractures at the highest levels and violence descends upon those below, geography remembers long after belief systems have evolved beyond recognition. The fracturing of power among beings who once ruled with unified authority did not announce itself with declarations or formal breaks. It gathered first in councils, in decisions delayed, in accusations spoken softly but recorded permanently on clay. The Sumerian tablets describe such moments with a calm that feels unsettling, recording debates among gods the way later scribes would document disputes between kings. These were not beings acting on divine impulse. They convened. They weighed outcomes. They authorized force after deliberation. War in this context was not passionate or chaotic. It was administrative, strategic. The division between Enlil's faction and that of Enki deepened over generations, but it was the ambitions of their sons that transformed tension into open conflict. Ninurta, heir to Enlil's authority, embodied discipline and enforcement. Its myths describe battles against creatures symbolizing chaos, serpents with multiple heads, mountains that rebel, storms that will not obey. Beneath the symbolic language lies a consistent image, a commander deploying overwhelming force to neutralize threats before they can spread or consolidate. He is praised in hymns not for mercy or wisdom but for effectiveness. Victory in his narratives is measured by the silence that follows. Enemies are not merely defeated, they are eliminated as possibilities. Cities aligned with them are not conquered, they are erased. This absolutism reflects a worldview where control cannot coexist with challenge. Authority must be total or it is meaningless. Marduk, by contrast, understood something the older generation consistently underestimated: numbers matter. Humans reproduced rapidly, adapted to local conditions, and remembered who helped them. Where Enlil saw noise and disorder requiring constant suppression, Marduk saw potential waiting to be organized. He positioned himself not as a distant ruler demanding tribute, but as a champion offering stability in exchange for loyalty. This was not rebellion in the overt sense, it was infiltration. Marduk did not attack Enlil's temples or denounce his authority openly. He simply built alternatives. Babylon rose quietly at first, positioned where rivers met and trade converged. Its growth was organic, driven by economic advantage and human preference. By the time Enlil's faction recognized the threat, displacement was already underway. The tool Marduk used most effectively was cosmology. He did not reject the old gods, he reorganized them. He absorbed their functions, their titles, even their names, reframing hierarchy until he stood at its apex not through conquest but through consolidation. This required intellectual infrastructure. Priests trained in Babylon developed astronomical records of unprecedented precision. They learned to predict eclipses, track planetary movements, and synchronize ritual calendars with celestial events. This gave them power. When harvests aligned with their predictions, trust followed. When festivals coincided with favorable omens, belief deepened. Control of time became control of meaning. Marduk did not need to appear in fire and thunder. His authority was embedded in the structure of reality itself. Or so it seemed to those who lived within the system he built. For Enlil's council, this represented an existential threat. Authority based on decree cannot compete with authority reinforced by daily confirmation. The old order relied on obedience inherited through fear of punishment. The new order promised reward. History shows which model spreads faster. Populations migrate toward benefit. Loyalty follows advantage. Strategically, the conflict focused on key zones of control. The Sinai Peninsula appears repeatedly in these ancient accounts as a place of particular importance. It is described with language that emphasizes boundaries, access, and exclusion. The mountain there trembles, fire descends upon it. Boundaries are drawn that cannot be crossed without death. Whether this describes a natural sacred site or something more functional, perhaps a facility for communication or transport between domains, the emphasis on restricted access is consistent. The cities of the Jordan Plain occupied the southern approach to this region. Their prosperity was not accidental. They sat astride routes that mattered not just for trade but for strategic movement. Allegiance with Marduk would have given him a forward position dangerously close to Enlil's last secure infrastructure. From a military perspective, this was a threshold that could not be allowed to be crossed. The decision to eliminate these cities was not framed as punishment for moral failure, but as strategic necessity. The language used in Sumerian texts speaks of releasing winds, not weather, but force in coordinated deployment. 7 winds are mentioned, suggesting either multiple strikes or multiple effects. Visit to the cities, the extraction of specific individuals, the insistence on rapid evacuation all fit patterns familiar in modern conflict. The target is neutralized without prolonged engagement. Even the instruction not to look back reflects understanding of blast physics, not spiritual obedience. Exposure to the flash causes blindness. Remaining within the affected zone ensures contamination. The destruction itself unfolds in phases. First comes the light described across cultures as unbearable, a false sun rising from the ground. This is thermal radiation arriving faster than sound, carrying heat that ignites surfaces on contact. Witnesses distant enough to survive report being unable to look directly at the source, as though the air itself were burning. The heat follows immediately. Temperatures exceed anything produced by wood, oil, or even bronze smelting. Stone begins to melt at its surface. Mud brick bubbles and deforms. Pottery glazes where it sits. Organic material, wood, cloth, flesh ceases to exist as structure. Carbon remains but form is lost. This kind of transformation requires sustained heat beyond 2000 degrees applied rapidly enough that materials do not have time to combust normally. They simply convert state. Then the shockwave, a wall of overpressure, traveling faster than sound. It strikes structures not like wind pushing but like a solid mass colliding. Walls designed to withstand siege engines collapse instantly. Not inward, as they would under gravity, but outward. blasted by force arriving from above and within simultaneously. Debris scatters in radial patterns. Bodies are pulverized, disarticulated, scattered across what will become the destruction layer. After the initial blast, the column rises. Smoke and dust and vaporized material climb vertically, pulled upward by the heat differential between ground and atmosphere. The column is thick enough to be visible for dozens of miles, dark enough to block sunlight, hot enough to create its own weather. At altitude, it spreads horizontally, forming the characteristic shape. Ancient witnesses described as resembling a furnace narrow at the bottom, expanding above. What makes this event catastrophic beyond the immediate destruction is what follows. The wind shifts. Fallout spreads. Particles too small to see settle over the surrounding region. They infiltrate soil. They contaminate water sources. They coat vegetation. This is the evil wind described in Sumerian laments, not immediate death but lingering consequence. Animals that graze sicken. Humans who drink contaminated water develop symptoms over days: nausea, bleeding, hair loss, lesions that will not heal. The description is clinical. These are not metaphors for divine anger. They are accurate observations of radiation poisoning or chemical exposure recorded by people who lacked scientific vocabulary but possessed functional eyesight and memory. The text emphasized that this wind could not be seen, yet it killed as surely as blade or fire. It moved according to breeze and current, indifferent to walls or shelter. Distance was the only protection, and even distance was not always enough. Here the accounts of the valley and of Sumer align with uncomfortable precision. The same aftermath appears in both sudden total destruction followed by lingering contamination, the same insistence on evacuation before the event, the same warnings about remaining in affected zones, the same long-term abandonment of fertile land. These are not poetic parallels. They are consistent descriptions of similar events recorded by different cultures. The irony is absolute and devastating. In attempting to prevent Marduk's rise by eliminating his forward positions, Enlil's faction unleashed weapons, whose consequences they could not contain. The fallout did not respect political boundaries. It spread according to atmospheric dynamics, poisoning regions far from the intended target. The southern cities of Mesopotamia, heartland of Enlil's own domain, suffered catastrophic collapse not from enemy action, but from their own unleashed force. Lamentation texts from this period do not celebrate victory. They mourn devastation. The language is not triumphant but traumatized. Cities are abandoned, fields lie empty. The gods themselves flee not from enemies, but from the consequences of their own decisions. They retreat to sealed chambers, to high ground, to places described as protected from the evil wind. This is not myth. This is survival protocol recorded by witnesses who understood shelter could be breached by something invisible. The texts describe paralysis, bleeding, despair. These are not wounds from conventional warfare. They are symptoms of exposure. Soldiers did not fall in battle, they sickened in camps. Populations did not flee invading armies, they evacuated regions where nothing visible threatened but everything felt wrong. Water that looked clean caused illness. Food that appeared safe led to wasting. The land itself had become hostile. From this point forward, power in Mesopotamia shifts decisively northward. Babylon, positioned beyond the path of the spreading contamination, survives intact. Its fields continue to produce. Its water remains drinkable. Its population grows as refugees arrive from poisoned southern regions. The catastrophe intended to prevent Marduk's ascent instead eliminates his rivals, leaving him dominant by default. This is not divine justice or cosmic plan. It is consequence. Once certain thresholds are crossed, control is lost. Weapons capable of erasing cities do not respect intention. They operate according to physics, dispersing energy and material according to laws that do not negotiate. The gods learned this as humans would later, that some tools destroy their users. The aftermath reshapes more than geography. It transforms theology itself. The gods who once walked among humans and commanded directly begin to withdraw. Presence becomes rare. Direct intervention gives way to mediated communication. Temples replace conversations. Priests interpret rather than relay. This withdrawal is not mystical evolution, it is practical necessity. The world has become too dangerous for proximity between mortals and those wielding power beyond sustainable control. In the generations that follow, Babylon consolidates authority not through military conquest but through cultural absorption. The Enuma Elish emerges, a creation epic that does not deny the old gods but reorganizes them. It presents a universe in chaos, ruled by beings unable to govern effectively. Disorder threatens everything. Then Marduk steps forward, young and capable. He offers a solution, but at a price: total authority once victory is achieved. The older gods, desperate, agree. Power is centralized, order is restored. The cosmos is restructured under single command. This narrative mirrors recent history with precision. The older order fragments and fails. Catastrophe nearly destroys everything. A new order emerges that promises stability through hierarchy. Those who accept the story accept the new power structure as necessary. Even benevolent. The genius of this approach is that it reframes dominance as responsibility rather than usurpation. Marduk does not seize control illegitimately in the myth, he is granted it by consensus. This transforms political reality into cosmic necessity. To question Babylon's authority becomes equivalent to inviting the chaos that nearly destroyed the world. Memory of disaster becomes justification for centralized power. Yet not everyone accepts this narrative. Other lineages carry different memories. Some remember the older order not as failed but as wronged. They preserve stories where the fire from heaven is not celebrated as restoration of order, but mourned as terrible excess. These memories do not vanish. They migrate with populations who refuse incorporation into Babylon's system. One such lineage traces itself to a man who witnessed the destruction from a distance. Abraham is traditionally remembered as a wandering patriarch, but his origins lie in one of the cities devastated by the malignant wind. His departure, later described as divine calling, aligns chronologically with the collapse of his homeland. In this context, the call to leave becomes less mystical and more urgent. Stay and perish, or go and survive. Abraham's God is not Marduk. This god does not reside in Babylonian temples or accept a place in the reorganized pantheon. The insistence on exclusive worship of no other gods makes sense only if other gods are understood not as false but as rival powers. Monotheism in this framework is not philosophical abstraction. It is political refusal. The covenant Abraham enters resembles older agreements between gods and kings, but with a crucial difference. Instead of binding a people to a city or empire, it binds a god to a people regardless of location. This portability makes the covenant resistant to conquest. You can destroy a temple, but you cannot destroy a mobile belief system carried in memory and practice. The stories this lineage preserves emphasize different aspects of the catastrophe. Where Babylonian texts frame destruction as necessary restoration of cosmic order, Abraham's descendants frame it as selective judgment. The emphasis shifts from hierarchy to behavior. Cities are destroyed not for political alignment, but for moral corruption. The narrative focus moves from power consolidation to ethical boundaries. Yet beneath these theological differences, both traditions preserve key details: warning before destruction, evacuation of the righteous, total annihilation of the target, aftermath that renders land unusable. The mechanism is forgotten or obscured, but the structure of the event remains consistent. Both traditions know that fire fell, that cities vanished, that land died, and that survival depended on distance and obedience to instructions given by those who knew what was coming. As centuries pass, these parallel memories harden into competing worldviews. One celebrates centralized power as salvation from chaos. The other emphasizes covenant, law, and separation from empire. Both trace their authority back to the same catastrophic era, but they draw opposite conclusions about what it means, what unites them as the scar. Neither side forgets the fire. Whether described as divine victory or divine judgment, it remains the axis around which belief turns. The ancient world glimpsed power capable of rewriting geography and extinguishing civilizations. That glimpse never fully fades. It shapes every system that comes after, not through conscious memory, but through inherited fear translated into structure. The gods retreat into symbol and law. Kings rule by mandate rather than presence. Humanity inherits a quieter world, constrained by rules whose origins are forgotten but whose weight remains. This is the long aftermath, the centuries during which catastrophe becomes theology. Memory becomes myth, and direct knowledge transforms into inherited caution. The land itself enforces these lessons with indifference to belief. Regions destroyed remain largely empty. Environmental damage persists across centuries. Attempts to resettle poison zones fail repeatedly. Crops wither, water remains bitter. Health declines among those who stay too long. These outcomes are not symbolic. They are measurable consequences that continue long after political systems change and religious narratives evolve. Geography becomes argument. The Dead Sea remains lifeless. The southern Jordan Plain supports only sparse vegetation. Southern Mesopotamia never fully recovers its early dominance. These are not punishments imposed by gods but effects created by forces that do not discriminate. Once certain damage is done, recovery timelines extend beyond human planning horizons. Some changes are effectively permanent on civilizational scales. This reality shapes how later societies understand risk. Taboos emerge around disturbing certain sites. Stories warn against entering cursed valleys. Regulations prohibit settlement in specific zones. These restrictions are framed religiously but function practically. They prevent populations from repeatedly exposing themselves to conditions that cause consistent harm. The ancient catastrophe thus becomes embedded in culture at every level. It influences law because unchecked authority demonstrated capacity for existential harm. It shapes religion because power beyond human scale requires explanation and boundaries. It affects architecture because permanence matters more after witnessing sudden total loss. It changes agriculture because dead land teaches respect for living soil. Most importantly, it alters the relationship between knowledge and application. Earlier civilizations appear to have possessed capabilities they later abandoned not from ignorance but from experience. After witnessing what concentrated power produces, restraint becomes wisdom. Technologies are not lost accidentally, they are buried deliberately. Knowledge is restricted, compartmentalized, hedged with warnings. This is visible in how craft traditions develop. Metalworking, astronomy, mathematics, these advance within guilds and priesthoods, where mastery requires years of supervised apprenticeship. Dangerous knowledge is tiered, basic competence is accessible, advanced understanding is guarded. The assumption is that capability without discipline invites catastrophe. The ancient world learned this lesson at unimaginable cost. Over time, the specific memory fades but behavioral patterns persist. Societies avoid certain forms of centralized authority. They distribute power across multiple institutions. They build redundancy into systems. They value stability over innovation. These choices are often explained through tradition or divine command, but their origin lies in trauma absorbed so deeply it became instinct. When later empires expand, they do so cautiously at first. Conquest is followed by integration rather than annihilation. Ruling ruins offers no advantage. This understanding spreads widely. Total destruction becomes rare and shocking precisely because collective memory retains a sense that some boundaries should not be crossed. Even warfare develops constraints. Codes of conduct emerge. Rules of engagement are articulated. While often violated, their existence indicates aspiration toward limited violence. The ancient catastrophe established a moral ceiling on destruction, not through philosophy, but through demonstration. Once humanity witnessed what total erasure looked like, it gained reference for what should be avoided. This restraint persists for centuries, embedded in custom and reinforced by environmental evidence. The land continues teaching through its scars. But restraint requires memory, and memory requires transmission. As generations accumulate and distance from the original event grows, the lesson weakens. What was visceral becomes abstract. What was immediate becomes ancient history. New civilizations arise that never directly experienced catastrophic collapse. They inherit warnings encoded as myth and taboo, but lack the context that made those warnings compelling. Gradually, confidence returns. Innovation accelerates. The boundaries that once seemed absolute begin to appear negotiable. This is when danger recurs, not because humanity lacks intelligence, but because it lacks humility renewed through proximity to consequence. The ancient catastrophe reshaped the world once. Its lesson was simple and brutal. Power without restraint destroys the future it attempts to secure. That lesson remained operative for centuries, encoded in every system built in its wake. Whether it would continue to guide humanity depended entirely on whether memory could be kept alive across generational distance from the original trauma. The answer emerged slowly. As the world moved further from the fire, the lesson did not disappear, it transformed. What began as immediate fear became philosophical principle. What started as survival instinct became ethical framework. The catastrophe aged from event into archetype, from history into pattern, from memory into mirror, and so the long shadow of the ancient catastrophe stretched across time, shaping not just what humanity remembered but what it chose to forget. Centuries turned and the world rebuilt itself around an absence. Cities rose again, but not in the valleys where salt still crusted the earth. Trade routes shifted to avoid regions where water remained bitter. Populations grew, but they grew elsewhere, leaving certain landscapes untouched not from reverence but from instinct. This avoidance was rarely explicit. Farmers did not gather in councils to declare certain fields permanently off-limits. Merchants did not formally reroute caravans around poisoned wells. The exclusion happened quietly, passed down through practical observation rather than decree. A grandfather would tell his grandson not to graze sheep in that valley because nothing good grows there. A mother would warn her daughter not to drink from that spring because it tastes wrong, and the livestock refuse it. Knowledge accumulated through small refusals, each one reinforcing the pattern without requiring explanation. In Mesopotamia, the great cities of the south diminished while northern settlements flourished. This shift was not merely political or economic. It was environmental. The land itself had changed in ways that made intensive agriculture difficult. Salt deposits increased. Water tables shifted. What had once been the most productive region in the known world became marginal, requiring greater effort for smaller yields. Populations followed resources, and resources concentrated where contamination had not reached. Babylon's dominance in this new arrangement appeared almost inevitable in hindsight, yet it emerged from contingency rather than design. The city had not been the largest or wealthiest before the catastrophe. It had been well positioned but not uniquely so. What distinguished it was survival intact. While southern cities struggled with failing fields and declining populations, Babylon absorbed refugees, skills, and institutional knowledge. It became the archive of what had been lost elsewhere. This consolidation of knowledge was not passive. Babylonian scribes actively collected text from abandoned libraries. They copied crumbling tablets, standardized dialects, and compiled scattered myths into coherent narratives. The Enuma Elish that emerged from this process was not an innocent creation story, but a political document that codified the new order. It explained why power should be centralized, why Marduk's supremacy was cosmically justified, and why questioning this arrangement risked returning to chaos. The brilliance of this theological framework lay in how it transformed recent trauma into timeless principle. The catastrophe was no longer a specific disaster caused by specific decisions. It became the inevitable consequence of disorder, a cosmic law as reliable as gravity. Fragmentation leads to collapse. Unity preserves stability. Therefore, centralized authority under Marduk's supremacy was not tyranny, but necessity, the only bulwark against existential threat for populations traumatized by recent collapse. This narrative offered profound psychological relief. Chaos had a cause, suffering had meaning. The future could be secured through proper order. All one had to do was accept hierarchy, follow ritual, obey authority. In exchange, stability was promised. The alternative, fragmentation, disorder, the malignant wind returning, was too terrible to contemplate, yet not all populations accepted this framework. Those who had fled rather than submitted carried different memories. They remembered the older gods not as failures but as betrayed by their own weapons. They remembered power concentrated in Babylon not as salvation, but as the consequence of having survived what others unleashed. But their refusal to integrate into the new system was not stubbornness but moral objection grounded in lived experience. Abraham's lineage represented one such thread of resistance. By the time his story was formalized into text, generations had passed since the original events. Details had blurred. Chronology had compressed. Yet the core remained intact, a command to leave the collapsing civilization, a promise of protection for those who separated themselves, and a covenant that bound deity to people rather than people to place. This portability made the tradition resilient, in ways temple-based religions could not match. The stories this community preserved emphasized different aspects of divine character. Their god was not primarily a cosmic organizer or maintainer of celestial machinery. He was a judge who evaluated behavior and responded with precision, punishing specific cities while sparing specific individuals. This selectivity mattered. It suggested that destruction was not inevitable given disorder but chosen in response to particular failures. It implied that right behavior could prevent catastrophe rather than merely delaying it. This moral framework created a different relationship with authority, where Babylonian religion taught obedience to hierarchy as cosmic necessity. Abraham's descendants developed covenant theology, a bilateral agreement where both parties bore responsibilities. God promised protection. Humans promised fidelity. Neither could break the covenant without consequence. This reciprocity limited both divine and human power, creating space for negotiation and appeal absent in more authoritarian systems. The difference can be seen in how each tradition handled prophecy. In Babylon, prophecy was state-controlled divination performed by trained priests who read omens in sheep livers or celestial movements. The purpose was to discern the will of the gods so the king could align his actions accordingly. Prophecy served power by providing legitimacy for decisions already made. In the Abrahamic tradition, prophecy became something more dangerous, individuals claiming direct communication with the deity, often in opposition to royal authority. Prophets emerged from outside priestly hierarchies to declare that kings had violated covenant and that disaster would follow. This created perpetual tension between political authority and moral critique, a tension that prevented either from achieving absolute dominance. Both systems emerged from the same catastrophic era, but they encoded opposite lessons. One said centralize power to prevent chaos. The other said limit power to prevent catastrophe. These were not abstract philosophical differences. They were competing responses to trauma, each attempting to ensure that what had happened would never happen again. As centuries passed, both traditions spread beyond their points of origin. Babylon's influence radiated through conquest and cultural prestige. Its astronomical knowledge, mathematical systems, and legal codes became foundational for successor civilizations. Even societies that rejected Babylonian theology often adopted Babylonian techniques for measuring time, predicting eclipses, and organizing urban space. The Abrahamic tradition spread differently through migration, diaspora, and the quiet persistence of communities that maintained distinct identity despite political subordination. This tradition traveled through family lines rather than state apparatus, making it harder to suppress but also harder to impose. It could survive the destruction of temples because it required no temples. It could endure exile because covenant traveled with the people. The tension between these approaches shaped the ancient Near East for over a millennium. Empires rose and fell: Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, each attempting to organize diverse populations under unified systems. Yet resistance persisted in communities that remembered older arrangements and preserved alternative narratives. The catastrophe that had destroyed the cities of the plain became, in different tellings, both justification for empire and warning against it. What neither tradition could escape was the physical reality underlying their theologies. The Dead Sea remained lifeless. The Jordan Plain remained marginal. Southern Mesopotamia never regained its early productivity. These environmental facts constrained all narratives attempting to explain them. You could interpret the destruction as divine judgment or cosmic necessity, but you could not make the land fertile again through interpretation. Reality remained stubbornly real. This persistence of environmental damage created a feedback loop that reinforced cultural memory. Each generation that encountered the barren zones received physical confirmation that something catastrophic had occurred there. The stories might evolve, details might shift, but the core claim that these places were destroyed suddenly and completely could not be dismissed as mere legend when the evidence remained visible. Archaeological evidence from this period shows patterns consistent with the textual accounts. Settlement gaps appear precisely where ancient sources describe devastation. Regions that had been continuously inhabited for centuries show sudden abandonment followed by long periods of minimal occupation. When resettlement eventually occurred, it was often by different populations with different material cultures, suggesting that original inhabitants did not return. More telling still are the destruction layers themselves. At sites identified with the ancient cities, excavation reveals not gradual decline but catastrophic termination. Structures are not slowly abandoned and stripped for materials, they are violently destroyed and left. The destruction layer contains evidence of extreme heat, sudden pressure, and unusual mineral deposits. These are not normal archaeological signatures of conquest or natural disaster. Contemporary with these destruction layers, other sites in the region show no evidence of warfare or disruption. This rules out invasion as explanation. Regional wars leave marks across landscapes. They do not annihilate cities selectively while leaving neighbors untouched. The pattern instead suggests targeted destruction of specific locations while surrounding areas remained functional. The same selectivity appears in Sumerian collapse. While southern cities declined catastrophically, northern settlements continued without interruption. This cannot be explained by economic shifts alone, which would produce gradual changes rather than sudden cessation. Environmental factors provide better explanation. Some regions became difficult to inhabit, while others remained viable. Soil analysis from affected regions shows anomalies that persist across millennia. Salt concentrations are higher than natural processes alone can explain. Certain isotope ratios appear unusual. Mineral distributions suggest contamination from external sources rather than local geology. These findings do not prove specific causes, but they confirm that something altered the environment in ways conventional disasters do not. Water sources show similar patterns. Springs that once supported settlements develop unusual chemistry. Lakes accumulate mineral loads beyond what watersheds should produce. The Dead Sea itself represents an extreme case water so dense with dissolved salts that nothing can live in it, fed by the Jordan River, which is itself unremarkable in chemistry. The transformation occurs within the basin, suggesting localized contamination rather than source issues. Plants growing near these zones show stress markers even in modern times. Growth rates decrease approaching certain areas. Reproductive success declines. Genetic analysis reveals mutations at rates higher than background radiation alone explains. These are subtle effects, measurable only with modern techniques, but they suggest that the environment retains characteristics that affect biological systems. Human health data, where available from ancient sources, hints at similar patterns. Medical texts from Mesopotamia describe clusters of symptoms: bleeding, hair loss, weakness, skin lesions appearing in specific regions following the catastrophic period. These descriptions align unsettlingly well with radiation exposure. Though ancient physicians had no such framework, they could only describe what they observed and note that certain areas seemed cursed with persistent sickness. Animal behavior adds another layer of evidence. Herders learned to avoid specific zones because livestock that grazed there sickened. Birds altered migration routes around certain valleys. These behavioral changes persisted across generations even after human memory of the original catastrophe faded. Animals responded to environmental cues humans could not detect, creating exclusion zones maintained by instinct rather than knowledge. All of this evidence accumulates into a consistent picture. Something happened in these regions that exceeded normal parameters of ancient disaster. The destruction was sudden, total, and left lasting environmental signatures. The effects were severe enough to cause permanent landscape alteration and population displacement. Recovery where it occurred was partial and slow. Traditional explanations struggle with this evidence. Earthquakes destroy but do not contaminate. Floods damage but do not sterilize. Warfare kills but does not poison land for centuries. Volcanic eruptions come closest to matching the effects, but the region shows no volcanic activity in the relevant period. The disaster signatures do not fit natural causes available in the Bronze Age world. This leaves two possibilities. Either the destruction resulted from natural phenomena we have not yet identified, or it resulted from deliberate application of technologies that exceeded what conventional history attributes to ancient civilizations. Both options are uncomfortable. The first requires postulating unknown natural processes that have not recurred. The second requires revising fundamental assumptions about human or pre-human technological capability. What makes the second option worth considering is not mysticism but pattern recognition. The ancient texts describe the destruction with consistent details that align with modern weapons effects. Blinding light, instantaneous heat, shockwaves, lingering contamination, exclusion zones. These are not random images, but specific observables. Ancient witnesses lacked technical vocabulary, but they possessed functional eyesight and memory. If we take their descriptions seriously rather than dismissing them as primitive superstition, a picture emerges. Beings with advanced capabilities used concentrated force to eliminate strategic targets. The deployment was precise enough to spare nearby locations, but overwhelming enough to ensure total destruction of intended sites. Survivors were warned to evacuate and not remain in the affected zone. Afterwards, the region became unsuitable for habitation. This scenario aligns with both textual and physical evidence better than conventional interpretations. It explains why destruction was selective rather than regional. It explains why warning preceded impact. It explains why environmental damage was so severe and persistent. It explains why technological details appear in ancient texts that supposedly describe divine miracles. The identity and origin of these beings remains uncertain. The Sumerian texts call them Anunnaki and describe them as arriving from elsewhere. Later traditions interpret them as angels, demons, or gods depending on theological framework. Modern speculation ranges from extraterrestrial intervention to lost human civilizations to misunderstood natural phenomena. The texts themselves are maddeningly vague on specifics. What matters most is not resolving their identity, but recognizing the pattern. Advanced capabilities were deployed, catastrophic destruction resulted, survivors encoded warnings into culture. Those warnings shaped civilization development for millennia. Whether the capabilities were extraterrestrial, terrestrial but lost, or misunderstood natural forces changes the backstory but not the lesson. That lesson is structural. Concentrated power, once unleashed, operates independently of intention. Consequences propagate beyond initial targets. Control is lost faster than it can be regained. Damage persists longer than the systems that caused it. These principles apply regardless of technology or origin. They governed ancient catastrophes, and they govern modern risks. The ancient world learned these principles through experience, so traumatic it reshaped every system that followed. Law, religion, ethics, governance, all were reorganized around preventing recurrence of what had happened. This was not philosophical evolution but practical adaptation. Societies that failed to internalize restraint did not persist. Those that encoded caution into their foundations survived. This selection pressure favored specific cultural traits. Humility became virtue, pride became sin. Excess was condemned. Limitation was praised. These values did not arise from abstract moral reasoning but from collective memory of what happened when boundaries were ignored. The ancient catastrophe functioned as a teaching moment powerful enough to rewrite human behavior at civilizational scale. Over time, this teaching diffused across cultures that had no direct knowledge of the original events. Myths of destroyed cities appear worldwide. Stories of fire from heaven are nearly universal. Warnings against hubris permeate ancient literature from Greece to India to China. These similarities suggest either shared origin or shared human experience of catastrophic consequence following overreach. The most persistent element across these traditions is the theme of forbidden knowledge. Whether framed as stealing fire from gods, eating forbidden fruit, or opening sealed containers, the pattern repeats. Humans gain access to something they should not have. Disaster follows and limitations are thereafter imposed. These stories are often read as anti-intellectual, but they encode something more specific. Not all knowledge should be applied immediately upon discovery. This principle shaped how civilizations approached innovation for thousands of years. Advances occurred, but they occurred slowly, tested within controlled environments before wider deployment. The apprenticeship model ensured that capability was paired with judgment developed over years of supervised practice. Knowledge was tiered so that dangerous understanding required demonstrated maturity before access was granted. Religious institutions played a crucial role in this system. By sacralizing certain boundaries and taboos, they created enforcement mechanisms that did not rely on rational argument. You did not need to understand why certain actions were forbidden to know they carried severe consequences. This created robust protection against catastrophic errors by individuals who lacked context to appreciate risks. The system was not perfect. It slowed beneficial innovation along with dangerous experimentation. It concentrated power in priestly classes who sometimes abused their positions. It created frustration among those who could see no rational justification for inherited restrictions. Yet it achieved its primary purpose, preventing the recurrence of catastrophic destruction through technological means beyond societal capacity to control. This achievement deserves recognition precisely because it appears passive. Civilizations are remembered for what they built, not what they avoided. Restraint leaves no monuments. Wise refusal generates no artifact. The absence of repeated catastrophe is invisible success, noticed only when comparing what happened to what might have happened. For roughly 3,000 years following the Bronze Age catastrophes, this system of inherited restraint functioned adequately. Empires rose and fell, populations grew, technologies advanced, but certain thresholds remained uncrossed. Wars were fought with blades, not weapons that poisoned land. Conflicts involved human-scale violence, not landscape alteration. Destruction remained reversible on human timescales. This equilibrium persisted not because humans became less violent or more moral, but because cultural memory continued to transmit warnings about specific boundaries. The stories evolved from historical accounts to myths to allegories, but their function remained constant. They marked certain possibilities as unacceptable, regardless of potential benefit. That equilibrium began to fracture when distance from the original catastrophe exceeded cultural memory's transmission range. Around 1500 years after the events, written records became fragmentary. Languages shifted. Empires rose that had no connection to the older Near Eastern traditions. New populations migrated into regions with no inherited knowledge of what had happened there. For these newcomers, the barren zones were simply marginal land to be avoided for practical reasons. The theological warnings meant nothing. The taboos held no weight. What had been sacred prohibition became mere superstition, and superstition is easily dismissed by those confident in their own rationality. Yet the physical environment continued to resist regardless of belief. Attempts to intensively farm the Dead Sea region failed just as consistently for Romans as for earlier populations. Water sources remained problematic. Health issues appeared among workers in certain areas. These practical failures maintained exclusion more effectively than forgotten stories could. But they did so without transmitting understanding of why exclusion mattered. This created vulnerability. When practical barriers alone maintain boundaries, those boundaries become targets for technological solutions. If land is barren, develop irrigation. If water is bitter, filter it. If health declines, improve medicine. Each solution enables incrementally greater exploitation, while understanding of underlying constraints deteriorates. This pattern practical problems inviting technological solutions that increase exposure to poorly understood risks would eventually reproduce globally, but in the ancient world it remained localized. Roman engineers could attempt to develop marginal land around the Dead Sea, but their failure was local and their empire vast enough to absorb the loss. The catastrophic potential remained dormant. What kept that potential dormant was not merely technology's limitations but culture's memory. Even as specific knowledge faded, generalized caution persisted. The ancient world developed what might be called a conservative epistemology, an assumption that old boundaries existed for reasons that should be respected even when those reasons were no longer fully understood. This conservatism manifested in multiple ways. Legal traditions emphasized precedent over innovation. Religious practices were performed exactly as taught with minimal variation. Building techniques replicated proven methods rather than experimenting with new approaches. Knowledge transmission favored faithful copying over creative interpretation. Modern perspective often views this conservatism as intellectual stagnation. From within ancient worldview, it was prudence. The world had demonstrated capacity to punish innovation catastrophically. Survival lay in not repeating whatever had triggered previous disasters. Since specific triggers were unclear, broad caution made sense. This produced societies that were in many ways risk-averse compared to modern norms. They innovated slowly, they tested cautiously, they scaled gradually. When problems appeared, they retreated rather than pushed forward. This approach limited growth, but also limited catastrophic failure modes. The trade-off was understood, if not always articulated. You could have rapid advancement, or you could have stability across generations. The ancient world, scarred by catastrophe and uncertain of its causes, chose stability. That choice shaped everything from architecture to agriculture to governance. Cities were built to last centuries, not decades. Institutions were designed for continuity, not disruption. Economies prioritized reliability over efficiency. These were not failures of imagination but deliberate choices grounded in experience of what happened when systems optimized for performance broke catastrophically. This orientation extended to natural philosophy and early science. Knowledge of the natural world accumulated through careful observation, but application lagged behind understanding. Greek philosophers knew the earth was round and estimated its circumference reasonably accurately. yet no one attempted to circumnavigate it. Islamic scholars understood optics and could have built telescopes, yet astronomy remained naked eye for centuries more. The gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application was not mere technical limitation. It reflected cultural hesitation about deploying new capabilities without understanding consequences. What modern era calls the precautionary principle was for ancient world standard operating procedure born from trauma. This hesitation weakened gradually as distance from catastrophe increased. Each generation that experienced stability gained confidence. Each successful innovation encouraged bolder experimentation. The memory of disaster faded from urgent warning to ancient history to mere mythology. Eventually, societies arose that knew the stories but did not believe them, or believed them only as moral allegory rather than practical warning. This transition from living memory to mythology to dismissal is visible in how ancient texts were read across time. Early readers treated destruction accounts as recent history requiring careful study. Later readers interpreted them as divine instruction about proper behavior. Eventually, they became children's stories, remarkable for their drama, but irrelevant to contemporary concerns. Each step in this progression weakened the protective barrier that collective memory had created. The knowledge remained encoded in texts and traditions, but its urgency dissolved. By the time civilizations again possessed capabilities comparable to those that had destroyed the Bronze Age cities, the warnings were so abstracted they no longer registered as applicable. This forgetting was not failure of archiving or education. Ancient libraries preserved texts meticulously. Religious traditions transmitted stories faithfully. The information remained accessible. What was lost was not the data but the context, the visceral understanding that these were not just stories but compressed survival instructions earned through unthinkable cost. Without that context, the information could not function as intended. It was like inheriting a detailed map without knowing what territory it described or why the journey mattered. The map remained accurate but useless because its relevance was no longer recognized. This is perhaps the most important meta-lesson from the ancient catastrophe. Information alone does not protect. Data must be paired with understanding of its significance. Knowledge must be embedded in systems that maintain its relevance across generations. Warnings must be renewed perpetually or they decay into noise. The ancient world understood this at some level. That is why warnings were encoded multiply in law and myth and ritual and taboo. Redundancy was built into transmission. Different cultural systems preserved overlapping information through different mechanisms. This created robustness against loss through any single channel, yet even redundancy eventually failed when all channels became subject to the same selective pressure, dismissal of old constraints as primitive superstition. Once that interpretation gained dominance, all the careful encoding meant nothing. The warnings remained, but they were read as artifacts of ignorance rather than distilled wisdom. This prepared the ground for eventual repetition of the pattern. Not immediately, not inevitably, but possible in ways that had not been possible for millennia. The cultural immune system humanity had developed in response to catastrophe had been gradually deactivated by success and distance. The world became vulnerable again to the precise risks it had organized itself to prevent. That vulnerability would not immediately manifest. Technological capability advances on different timelines than cultural wisdom erodes. A gap opens where danger becomes possible before it becomes actual. In that gap lies the space for choice, the possibility of recognizing patterns before they complete and choosing different outcomes based on inherited knowledge, even when that knowledge is no longer viscerally felt. The question that emerged from this long historical arc was whether humanity could learn from patterns without repeating them. Could we recognize catastrophic trajectories before reaching their conclusions? Could memory function across sufficient distance to guide decisions? Or does each age insist on learning for itself through the same brutal teacher that instructed the ancients? The answer would not be determined by intelligence or technology. Both could be deployed toward repetition or avoidance with equal facility. What mattered was humility, the willingness to consider that old warnings might encode wisdom even when their origins were obscure. That modern confidence might be as misplaced as ancient confidence was. That capability and safety were not equivalent. The ancient catastrophe offered this lesson freely. It remained encoded in texts, visible in landscapes, embedded in traditions. But lessons do not teach themselves. They require students willing to learn. The world that emerged from Bronze Age collapse had been such a student, schooled by trauma into caution. Whether later ages would maintain that posture or repeat the trajectory remained undecided. What was certain was that the pattern existed. It had happened before. It could happen again. The only variables were scale, timing, and whether recognition would arrive in time to matter. The past was not prophecy, but it was prologue. How the story continued depended entirely on whether those reading it understood that they were characters in its continuation rather than merely audience to its completion. In the generations that followed the catastrophe, those who survived carried forward not just stories but something deeper, a bodily knowledge of how quickly permanence could vanish. Old men who had been children in the destroyed cities would wake at night, decades later, still hearing echoes of sounds that should have been impossible. The memory lived in the flesh, in the way their hands trembled when lightning split the sky, in the way they flinched from heat that reminded them of that other heat, that day when the world ended. These survivors built differently than their ancestors had. Walls were thicker than strictly necessary, granaries were redundant, water sources were multiple. Nothing was optimized to the point of fragility. Every structure incorporated margin for error, space for the unexpected, room for things to go wrong without triggering complete failure. This was not primitive engineering, it was trauma-informing designs. Their children learned these habits without understanding their origin. Why do we build this way? Because this is how it is done. Why do we store so much? Because lean times come unexpectedly. Why do we avoid that valley? Because nothing good comes from there. The knowledge transmitted without full explanation, encoded in practice rather than theory, this created a civilization that was in some ways less ambitious than what preceded it. Buildings were shorter. Cities were smaller. Trade networks were more localized. But it was also more resilient. When drought came, redundant water systems provided backup. When harvests failed, stored grain prevented famine. When conflicts erupted, decentralized authority prevented total system collapse. The shift was visible in material culture. Earlier pottery had been thin-walled, optimized for minimal clay use and maximum capacity. Post-catastrophe ceramics were thicker, heavier, less efficient, but more durable. Earlier tools were specialized, each designed for specific tasks. Later tools were more general purpose, functional across multiple applications. The trend was consistent, away from optimization toward robustness. This applied to social organization as well. Political power became more distributed. Instead of single kings ruling vast territories, authority fractured into local leaders governing smaller domains. This reduced efficiency and coordinated action but also reduced catastrophic failure modes. If one city-state collapsed, others continued functioning. Diversity replaced monoculture. Religious practice showed similar evolution. The older centralized temple complexes with their enormous priesthoods gave way to smaller local shrines. Divine power was described less in terms of overwhelming cosmic force and more in terms of protective presence. Gods became less terrifying, more accessible. This reflected a population that had seen what unconstrained power produced and wanted no part of it. Even warfare changed character. The Bronze Age collapses had demonstrated that total victory could be more catastrophic than defeat if it destroyed infrastructure necessary for sustaining life. Later conflicts became more ritualized, bound by constraints that seem arbitrary until understood as attempts to prevent escalation toward mutual destruction. Battles had rules. Campaigns had seasons. Certain sites were off-limits regardless of military advantage. These developments were not conscious social engineering. They emerged organically from populations whose visceral memory of catastrophe was fresh enough to shape behavior at every level. The catastrophe had functioned as selection pressure, filtering out practices and structures that created fragility while preserving those that enhanced survival. This produced what historians later called a dark age, a period of reduced complexity, smaller populations, and less elaborate material culture. But from the perspective of those living through it, this was recovery. They had seen complexity fail spectacularly. They had witnessed centralization become vulnerability. Simplicity was not regression but adaptive response. The knowledge preserved from earlier eras was carefully curated. Not everything was worth saving. Technologies that enabled extreme concentration of power were abandoned deliberately. Techniques that had allowed rapid exploitation of resources were set aside. What was maintained and transmitted were technologies of sustainability, crop rotation, soil conservation, water management, metallurgy at scales that did not require massive forced labor. This curation was sometimes encoded explicitly in prohibitions. Do not do this, do not make that, do not go there. But more often it was encoded in absence, in techniques simply not taught, in knowledge not recorded, in questions not asked. The gap between what was theoretically possible and what was actually practiced widened deliberately. Literacy rates declined during this period, but this was not mere loss. The social role of writing shifted. Instead of being a tool of complex administration, it became primarily a vehicle for preserving essential knowledge and sacred texts. What was written down mattered more because less was written. Each text represented deliberate choice about what future generations needed to remember. The stories that were recorded, copied, and transmitted with greatest care were those that encoded warnings, flood narratives, destruction of cities, falls of civilizations. These were not entertainment or history for its own sake, they were instruction manuals in what to avoid. Their repetition in diverse cultures suggests not shared origin alone, but shared recognition that these patterns mattered existentially. In these stories, certain themes recur with notable consistency. Pride precedes destruction. Excess invites disaster. Boundaries exist for reasons. Authority concentrated becomes tyrannical. Knowledge pursued without restraint endangers all. These were not abstract moral principles, but compressed lessons from recent experience. The ancient catastrophe had demonstrated each of these truths with brutal clarity. Cities that had seemed invincible vanished. Rulers who commanded vast territories died choking on poisoned air. Technologies that promised mastery produced desolation. The survivors absorbed these lessons and encoded them into every aspect of culture, not as punishment, but as protection. Law codes from this period reflect this orientation explicitly. Hammurabi's code and similar texts are often read as harsh and punitive, but they served a different purpose than modern law. They were not primarily about justice in the abstract, but about preventing escalation. Disproportionate punishment for seemingly minor offenses made sense if those offenses were known to lead toward catastrophic outcomes when left unchecked. The famous eye for an eye principle was not crude revenge but sophisticated limitation. It established proportionality, that response must not exceed offense. This prevented spiraling retaliation that could consume societies. In a world that had recently witnessed disproportionate response destroy entire civilizations, proportionality was existential necessity, not mere ethics. Religious texts from the period show similar concerns. The emphasis on obedience, on following commands exactly as given without deviation or interpretation, reflects societies that had learned the cost of creative improvisation when stakes were existential. When the wrong decision can poison the land for generations, perhaps rigid adherence to tested procedures makes more sense than innovation. The ritual cleanliness laws that appear in multiple traditions during this era, elaborate rules about what can be touched, eaten, or mixed, can be read as early contamination protocols. In a world where invisible dangers lurked in certain places and objects, developing systematic avoidance procedures saved lives, even when the mechanism was not understood. Better to follow rules that seemed arbitrary than to experiment and discover they had reason after all. Women's roles changed during this period in complex ways. In the earlier era of centralized power, women had sometimes held positions of significant authority. The post-catastrophe world was more patriarchal in formal structure, yet women's practical power often increased. In smaller, more decentralized communities, the roles of wife and mother, as maintainers of household and preservers of tradition, carried enormous influence over actual survival. Oral tradition, maintained primarily by women in many cultures, became crucial for preservation of knowledge across the literacy gap. Stories, songs, and recipes encoded information about plant properties, seasonal indicators, and survival techniques. This knowledge was simultaneously mundane and existential. The difference between a community eating or starving, healing or sickening. The elderly gained status during this period as living archives. In earlier civilizations, written records could substitute for memory. After the collapse, with libraries burned and scribal schools closed, old people who remembered how things were done became invaluable. Societies that honored elders survived better than those that did not, creating selection pressure for veneration of age. Children were raised differently as well. The carefree childhood possible in times of plenty gave way to early apprenticeship and training. Skills were transmitted young because uncertainty about the future made every moment of learning precious. This created populations with deep practical knowledge, but perhaps less abstract theorizing. The emphasis was on what worked, not why it worked. Trade resumed gradually during this recovery period, but its character changed. Instead of luxury goods moving between palace complexes, trade focused on essentials, metal, grain, salt. Merchants were more local, operating within known networks rather than venturing into unknown territories. Risk was minimized because the margin for catastrophic loss was small. This caution extended to exploration. The earlier Bronze Age world had been expansive, with maritime trade reaching across Mediterranean and beyond. The recovery period was more conservative. Ships stayed closer to shore, caravans followed established routes. Unknown territories remained unknown because investigating them offered little benefit. Maps from this period, when they existed at all, were more qualitative than quantitative. They marked dangers rather than celebrating conquests. Here be poisoned waters, here the earth gives sickness, here travelers do not return. These were not primitive geography but practical information prioritized by survivors who had learned that not all places were safe to enter. Architecture became more fortified, but not primarily against human enemies. Walls were built to withstand environmental catastrophe, flood, earthquake, fire. Structures were designed with refuge spaces where populations could shelter when warning came. These designs reflected societies that expected disaster to strike again and wanted to be prepared. Agricultural practices became more diverse and less intensive. Instead of vast monoculture fields maximizing short-term yields, smaller plots grew varied crops. This reduced total production but increased resilience against crop failure. If one crop failed, others might succeed. If one field was ruined, others remained productive. Efficiency was sacrificed for survivability. Water management became obsessive. Springs were protected, wells were maintained, cisterns were dug redundantly. This was partly practical response to variable rainfall, but the intensity suggests something more: a deep anxiety about water sources becoming unreliable or poisoned, as they had in the catastrophe zones. Water security became foundational to settlement decisions. Craft specialization decreased. Instead of full-time artisans producing single product types, most people maintained multiple skills. A farmer could also work metal, weave cloth, and build basic structures. This made communities more self-sufficient and less vulnerable to disruption of trade networks. Redundancy extended to human capability. Warfare, when it occurred, was less about expansion and more about resources or survival. The earlier empires had conquered for prestige and tribute. Post-catastrophe conflicts were more defensive, protecting what you had rather than taking what others possessed. Armies were smaller, campaigns shorter, objectives more limited. Pyrrhic victory was understood as defeat. The concept of honor changed during this period. Earlier honor cultures celebrated boldness, risk-taking, and displays of individual prowess. Recovery cultures valued reliability, steadiness, and contribution to group survival. The hero was not the warrior who killed most enemies, but the farmer who ensured the community ate, the elder who remembered crucial knowledge, the mother who raised children to adulthood. This reorientation of values was not universal or immediate. Different regions adapted differently based on their specific experience. Those closest to catastrophe zones changed most drastically. Those at greater distance maintained more continuity with earlier patterns. But the overall trend was consistent, away from maximizing and toward sustaining. Over centuries, these adapted societies became the new normal. Children born into the recovery world knew nothing else. The earlier Bronze Age, with its great palaces and far-reaching trade networks and powerful centralized states, became mythological stories of a golden age when things were different, before the catastrophe. These myths served multiple functions: preserving memory, explaining present conditions, and warning against attempting to recreate what had failed catastrophically. This mythologizing created psychological distance from the catastrophe. It was no longer something that happened to living memory, but something that happened to ancestors in a different age, under different circumstances. This distance was necessary for communities to function without paralyzing fear. But it also began the process of forgetting, of losing the visceral understanding that made the warnings urgent rather than merely interesting. The first cracks in the protective cultural barriers appeared when distance from catastrophe exceeded generational memory. When no one alive remembered anyone who remembered the actual events, the stories became less immediate. They remained important culturally and religiously, but their practical urgency faded. Warnings became traditions, traditions became customs, customs became optional. This erosion was gradual, measured in centuries rather than decades. But it was relentless. Each generation that experienced relative stability gained confidence. Each successful harvest, each peaceful year, each crisis navigated without catastrophe reinforced the sense that maybe the old fears were exaggerated. Maybe the ancestors were more primitive, less capable. Maybe the dangers they fled were not as severe as imagined. This creeping confidence enabled experimentation with boundaries that had been absolute. Not dramatic violations, those would trigger backlash, but incremental extensions. Slightly more intensive agriculture, slightly more specialized craft production, slightly more centralized authority. Each expansion tested limits without obviously crossing them. When these experiments succeeded, when intensive farming produced bumper crops, when specialization increased quality, when centralization enabled coordinated projects, they validated expansion. Success bred emulation. What one community achieved, others attempted. Gradually, the system drifted away from the cautious, distributed, redundant model that had been forged in catastrophe's wake. This drift was not conscious abandonment of wisdom. Most people remained unaware it was happening. They were simply responding to immediate incentives and opportunities. The protective barriers erected by traumatized ancestors eroded not through deliberate dismantling, but through slow neglect as their purpose was forgotten. By the time new civilizations arose that resembled the pre-catastrophe Bronze Age world in complexity and ambition, the connection to ancient warnings was tenuous. The stories remained, but they were read as mythology rather than instruction. The ruins remained, but they were tourist destinations rather than lessons. The dead zones remained, but they were curiosities rather than warnings. Humanity had been given a second chance, a reset after catastrophic failure. The survivors had used that chance to build more carefully, more sustainably, more humbly. They had encoded hard-won wisdom into every aspect of their culture. For centuries, that wisdom protected their descendants. But wisdom encoded is not wisdom internalized, and protection maintained through habit becomes vulnerable when habits are questioned by generations that never experienced the danger they were designed to prevent. The slow forgetting had begun. Whether it would complete before memory could be recovered remained to be seen. But the pattern was established, the same pattern that preceded the original catastrophe. Confidence rising, caution fading, boundaries tested, capabilities expanding. The ancient cycle preparing to turn again. The world that emerged from centuries of recovery eventually reached a threshold where memory and ambition stood in unstable balance. Cities grew again, not to their former size at first, but large enough to require coordination beyond face-to-face relationships. Trade networks extended beyond regional boundaries, connecting communities that had operated independently for generations. Knowledge that had been carefully restricted began to circulate more widely as literacy expanded and scribal schools reopened. This expansion felt like Renaissance, like humanity reclaiming capabilities that had been lost. Temples were rebuilt on grander scales. Irrigation systems were extended into marginal lands. Metalworking techniques improved, producing tools and weapons of higher quality. Each achievement validated the trajectory, suggesting that the old cautions had been excessive, that progress was possible without triggering catastrophe. Yet subtle signs appeared for those trained to recognize them. Agricultural intensification began to show familiar patterns, soil fertility declining in regions worked too aggressively, salt deposits accumulating where irrigation was pushed beyond sustainable limits. These effects were localized at first, easily addressed by shifting to new fields or adjusting techniques, but the pattern was consistent with early stages of processes that had contributed to earlier collapses. Water sources showed strain as well. Springs that had flowed reliably began to diminish as populations concentrated around them. Wells were dug deeper, requiring more labor for less yield. Competition for water rights generated tensions between communities that had previously cooperated. These were manageable conflicts at first, resolved through negotiation or occasional skirmishes, but they indicated systems approaching capacity limits. Trade disputes multiplied as networks grew more complex. Standardization of weights and measures became contentious when different regions resisted adopting foreign systems. Quality control issues appeared when production scaled beyond what guild structures could monitor effectively. Debt relationships became more complicated as credit extended across greater distances and longer timescales. The economic machinery was becoming too intricate for existing institutions to govern smoothly. Political structures struggled to adapt to this complexity. City-states that had maintained independence through careful diplomacy found themselves pressured to align with emerging power centers. Smaller communities were absorbed into larger political units, sometimes voluntarily for protection, sometimes through coercion. The trend was toward consolidation, toward fewer, but more powerful centralized authorities. Kings began to speak differently about their rule. Earlier monarchs had emphasized their role as stewards, maintaining tradition and ensuring stability. Later rulers described themselves as chosen instruments of divine will, authorized to reshape society according to cosmic plans. The language shifted from custodianship to command, from preservation to transformation. This rhetorical change reflected and reinforced growing concentration of power. Religious institutions followed similar trajectories. Local shrines and practices were gradually incorporated into more standardized systems, organized around major temples. These temples accumulated wealth and land, becoming economic powers in their own right. The priesthoods that managed them gained influence that transcended spiritual authority, extending into political and economic domains. Divine service and social control became difficult to distinguish. The relationship between religious and political authority grew increasingly intertwined. Kings claimed divine sanction for their rule. Priests relied on royal patronage for temple construction and maintenance. This mutual dependency created stability but also reduced checks on power. When church and state aligned, who could question either without challenging both? The distributed authority structure that had provided resilience after the catastrophe was consolidating into hierarchies that resembled pre-catastrophe patterns. Intellectual life flourished during this period, but within increasingly defined boundaries. Schools were established to train scribes, priests, and administrators. These institutions preserved and transmitted knowledge effectively, but they also controlled what knowledge was preserved and how it was interpreted. Texts were copied selectively. Certain questions were encouraged while others were subtly discouraged. The curriculum prepared students for roles within existing systems rather than to question those systems. Scientific understanding advanced in practical domains. Astronomy improved, enabling better calendars and navigation. Mathematics developed to handle increasingly complex accounting and engineering. Medicine progressed through systematic observation and testing of treatments. These were genuine intellectual achievements that improved lives and demonstrated human capability for cumulative learning, yet certain kinds of inquiry remained constrained. Questions about the nature of power, about alternative social organizations, about the validity of inherited hierarchies, these were not pursued systematically. Philosophical traditions that emerged during this period tended to justify existing arrangements rather than critique them. The intellectual framework was sophisticated but operated within assumptions that preserved social order. This was not necessarily cynical or oppressive. Societies that had experienced catastrophic collapse had reasonable concern about stability. Challenging fundamental structures risked unleashing forces that could spiral beyond control. The caution was understandable even as it limited inquiry. The question was whether limitations could be maintained consciously and adjusted deliberately, or whether they would simply be forgotten until rediscovered through catastrophic failure. Art from this period reflects the tension between achievement and anxiety. Monumental architecture demonstrated technical mastery and organized labor on impressive scales. But the imagery emphasized order, symmetry, and hierarchy. Gods were depicted as distant and powerful rather than intimate. Kings were shown in poses of dominance rather than service. The aesthetic celebrated control rather than harmony, reflecting societies that felt perpetually on the edge of chaos requiring forceful management. Literature became more stratified. Epic poetry celebrating heroic individuals persisted but was joined by wisdom literature emphasizing proper behavior and knowing one's place. The hero who challenged boundaries was increasingly portrayed as cautionary rather than admirable. Hubris became a central theme, the idea that exceeding proper limits invited divine punishment. This represented cultural memory of catastrophe being encoded into narrative form, Though the connection to specific historical events was increasingly obscure, legal codes grew more elaborate as societies became more complex. Earlier laws had been relatively simple basic prohibitions and proportional punishments. Later codes were comprehensive, covering an expanding array of circumstances with specified procedures and penalties. This legal complexity served real needs in sophisticated urban environments, but it also created dependency on specialized interpreters. Justice required experts, and experts required institutional support, further concentrating power. The treatment of foreigners and outsiders shifted during this period as well. Earlier post-catastrophe societies had been relatively open to incorporating refugees and migrants, perhaps because population losses made every person valuable. Later, more established societies grew more concerned with maintaining distinct identities. Boundaries between groups hardened, insider-outsider distinctions became more important. This tribalism provided social cohesion but also enabled exploitation and conflict. Slavery expanded during these centuries after having nearly disappeared in the immediate post-catastrophe period. When populations were small and labor scarce, enslaving captives made less sense than integrating them into communities. As societies grew wealthier and warfare more common, slavery became economically viable and socially acceptable. This institution concentrated wealth while creating populations with no stake in system stability, a pattern that historically preceded major upheavals. Gender relations became more rigidly defined as well. The relative flexibility of the recovery period gave way to more formal patriarchal structures. Women's roles were increasingly confined to domestic spheres, their legal status declined. Justifications were offered based on religious texts or natural law, but the effect was systematic exclusion from formal power. This reduced the diversity of perspective in decision-making, potentially making societies more vulnerable to blind spots and groupthink. Military technology and organization advanced significantly. Bronze weapons gave way to iron, which was cheaper to produce and held better edges. This democratized warfare. Somewhat more soldiers could be equipped effectively, but it also made conflicts more destructive. The tactics and fortifications that had worked in the Bronze Age became obsolete. Siege warfare became more devastating. Battles generated higher casualties. War remained constrained by season and logistics but became more lethal when it occurred. Empires emerged during this period, states that ruled multiple cities and diverse populations across significant territories. These empires were not merely larger kingdoms but qualitatively different political entities. They required bureaucracies to administer, armies to enforce, and ideologies to justify their existence. The scale of organization was impressive, but it created new vulnerabilities. Empires could accomplish more than city-states, but they could also fail more catastrophically. The Assyrian empires exemplified these dynamics. It built an administrative apparatus of remarkable sophistication, with standardized communication, road networks, and provincial governors reporting to central authority. It maintained a professional army capable of sustained campaigns across vast distances. It developed ideological narratives presenting Assyrian rule as divinely ordained and beneficial to conquered peoples. These capabilities enabled territorial expansion unprecedented in scope, but the Assyrian system also revealed characteristic vulnerabilities of complex centralized states. The administrative apparatus required immense resources to maintain. The professional army needed constant payment and deployment to justify its expense. Subject peoples required continuous monitoring and occasional violent suppression to prevent revolt. The system had to keep expanding or growing more extractive to sustain itself, and both strategies had limits. When those limits were reached, when conquerable territories were exhausted and extractable resources depleted, the system faced crisis. Assyria responded with increasing brutality, deporting populations, destroying rebellious cities, and terrorizing subjects into compliance. This maintained control temporarily but created desperation that eventually fueled coordinated resistance. When multiple subject peoples revolted simultaneously while external enemies pressed borders, the empire collapsed rapidly and completely. The fall of Assyria demonstrated that sophistication and power did not guarantee stability. The system could be both impressive in capability and catastrophically fragile in structure. This lesson was available to subsequent civilizations, but it competed with another interpretation, that Assyria simply erred in specific ways that could be avoided through better management. The alternative readings suggested empires were viable if properly designed and executed. The Persian Empire that emerged after Assyria's fall seemed to validate this optimistic interpretation. Persia built on Assyrian precedents but modified the approach, allowing greater local autonomy, tolerating diverse religious practices, and presenting itself as liberator rather than oppressor. This generated less resistance while maintaining control. The system appeared more sustainable, capable of lasting longer than Assyrian brutality had allowed. Yet Persian success obscured underlying continuities. It too depended on constant resource extraction from subject peoples. It too required military power to enforce compliance when persuasion failed. It too concentrated decision-making in central authority that could not fully understand conditions in distant provinces. The vulnerabilities were present but masked by competent administration and fortunate circumstances. The question was not whether the system was stable but how long stability could be maintained before accumulated stresses triggered failure. The Greek city-states offered an alternative model during this same period. Instead of empire, they maintained political independence while sharing cultural identity. Instead of centralized monarchy, many experimented with distributed authority through assemblies and councils. Instead of professional standing armies, they relied on citizen militias. This approach sacrificed coordination. Athens, in particular, developed a system where political participation extended unusually far down social hierarchy. Citizens voted directly on major decisions rather than merely electing representatives. Leadership rotated rather than being concentrated in permanent offices. This created inefficiencies and sometimes chaotic politics, but it also prevented power from consolidating dangerously. The system included mechanisms for removing leaders who became too powerful or popular, recognizing that individual authority posed risks to collective. Citizenship was restricted to a minority of residents, excluding women, foreigners, and slaves. The system was small-scale, functioning in a city-state of tens of thousands rather than an empire of millions. Economic inequality persisted even among citizens. Yet within its constraints, Athens demonstrated that alternatives to centralized authority were viable, that distributed power could function, that participation could be broadened without triggering collapse. The tension between these models, empire versus independence, centralization versus distribution, professional versus citizen, defined much of the period's politics and warfare. Neither model was clearly superior across all dimensions. Empires could coordinate large projects to maintain order across diverse regions. Independent cities could respond flexibly and maintain higher civic engagement. The optimal structure likely depended on circumstances, but circumstances were rarely clear until they had passed. What both models shared was gradual erosion of the protective, cautious culture that had emerged after the Bronze Age catastrophe. Confidence had returned. Ambition had rekindled. The sense that terrible consequences awaited overreach had faded into background assumptions rather than urgent imperatives. Societies remembered that they should be careful, but they were increasingly vague about what specifically to be careful about. The old warnings could be read as merely advocating prudence in general rather than prohibiting specific actions. The taboos could be understood as historical artifacts rather than timeless requirements. The boundaries could be viewed as conventional rather than fundamental. Each generation inherited constraints but also questioned them, and questioning without visceral memory of consequences slowly eroded effectiveness. Economic development accelerated this process. As wealth increased, populations grew and cities expanded. This growth generated immediate benefits: more food, more goods, more opportunities. It also created dependencies. Cities needed constant supply from rural areas. Specialized craftsmen needed trade networks to exchange products. Administrative classes needed tax revenue to maintain positions. Once systems scaled beyond certain thresholds, contraction became difficult without triggering cascading failures. This locked societies into growth trajectories, whether or not continued growth was sustainable. Stopping would crush the system. Continuing might lead to overreach and catastrophic failure, but stopping was immediate and certain pain, while continuation offered hope that solutions might be found, that limits might be extended, that past patterns might not apply. Under these conditions, most societies chose continuation, gambling on ingenuity over caution. Technological innovation contributed to this dynamic. Each advanced better plows, improved irrigation, stronger metals temporarily raised productive capacity and pushed limits outward. This reinforced belief that limits were not fixed but could be transcended through cleverness and effort. The successes were real and beneficial. They saved lives and reduced hardship. But they also created confidence that exceeded wisdom, belief that capability equaled safety. Agricultural innovations exemplified this pattern. Crop rotation systems increased yields without depleting soil as quickly. Terracing enabled farming on slopes previously unusable. Improved storage reduced spoilage. These were genuine advances that fed growing populations. But they also enabled population growth beyond what traditional methods could support. Once populations expanded, maintaining the innovations became essential. Failure would be catastrophic for more people than ever before. Similar dynamics appeared in urban sanitation and water supply. Engineering advances allowed cities to grow denser without immediate disease outbreaks. Aqueducts brought water from distant sources. Drainage systems removed waste. These innovations made urban life healthier and more pleasant. They also enabled cities to exceed scales that local resources could support sustainably. The cities became dependent on maintaining elaborate infrastructure that required constant investment and maintenance. The analogy to modern challenges is striking, but the ancient world moved at a slower pace. Problems developed over generations rather than years, allowing more time for adjustment, but also for normalizing dysfunction. Populations could adapt to gradually worsening conditions without recognizing a threshold had been crossed. The proverbial frog in slowly heating water was not ancient parable but actual historical pattern. Religious responses to these tensions were complex and contradictory. Some traditions emphasized divine judgment and coming catastrophe, calling for repentance and return to simpler ways. These prophetic voices warned that current trajectories were unsustainable, that divine patience had limits, that catastrophe would strike suddenly when least expected. Their warnings drew explicitly on memories of past destructions, framing contemporary conditions as dangerously similar. Other religious voices emphasized divine providence and support for just rule. They argued that prosperity was evidence of divine favor, that power served divine purposes, that obedience to established authority aligned with cosmic order. These traditions supported rather than challenged existing systems, providing legitimacy and encouraging confidence, rather than caution. Both orientations claimed grounding in ancient texts and traditions. Both could cite precedents and authorities. The scriptures that had emerged from catastrophe were rich enough to support multiple interpretations. Without clear adjudication criteria, each tradition could claim authenticity while reaching opposite conclusions about appropriate response to contemporary challenges. This interpretive flexibility meant religious tradition could not reliably function as brake on dangerous trajectories. When warnings were issued, they competed with reassurances. When caution was urged, confidence was simultaneously encouraged. The net effect was ambiguity rather than clear guidance. Religious institutions preserved memory of catastrophe, but could not translate that memory into effective restraint on present behavior. Philosophical traditions struggled with similar tensions. Thinkers recognized that civilizations could fail, that power could be misused, that prosperity could be temporary. They articulated concerns about hubris, excess, and overreach. But their influence remained limited to educated elites. Philosophical sophistication did not translate into policy change or behavioral modification at societal scale. Wisdom remained confined to texts that were admired but not implemented. Some philosophers responded by withdrawing from public life, cultivating personal virtue, while accepting that broader society would follow its trajectory, regardless of wisdom. This Stoic or Epicurean approach offered psychological refuge for individuals, but abandoned collective intervention. Others continued engaging politically, offering advice to rulers and arguing for reforms. But their successes were limited and often temporary. A wise king might implement thoughtful policies only to have his successor reverse them. The problem was structural rather than merely intellectual. Even if everyone understood risks and agreed on solutions, implementation required coordination across competing interests. Merchants benefited from expanded trade. Landowners benefited from higher production. Officials benefited from growing revenues. Soldiers benefited from campaigns. Each constituency had incentives to support continuation rather than contraction, growth rather than limitation. Building coalitions for restraint was far more difficult than building coalitions for expansion. War provided periodic resets through destruction that forced simplification. Defeats collapsed over extended empires. Invasions destroyed elaborate systems. Migrations disrupted established patterns. These catastrophes were traumatic for those experiencing them, but they cleared ground for rebuilding. In this sense, periodic violent disruption served functions similar to fire in forest ecosystems, destructive but also renewing. However, this pattern was not sustainable as destructive capacity increased. Bronze Age warfare had been limited by technology and scale. Later Iron Age conflicts generated higher casualties and more complete destruction. As military technology advanced, war became less corrective and more catastrophic. The margin between defeat that forced adjustment and defeat that triggered civilizational collapse narrowed. The Persian Wars demonstrated how conflict could serve both functions. For Persia, the failed invasion of Greece checked imperial expansion without triggering collapse. The empire absorbed the defeat and redirected attention elsewhere. For Greek cities, the wars forced unprecedented cooperation and generated confidence that lasted generations. Both sides drew lessons, though not necessarily accurate ones. Persia learned to avoid Greece. Athens learned it could challenge empires. Neither fully grasped how contingent their outcomes had been. The Peloponnesian War decades later showed the darker pattern. Athens and Sparta fought for nearly 3 decades in a conflict that exhausted both. Cities were destroyed, populations massacred, economies ruined. The victors gained little while the defeated lost immensely. Greek civilization as a whole declined in political power even as cultural influence continued spreading. The war resolved nothing structurally while damaging the systems it was supposedly fought to preserve. These examples suggested that war's effectiveness as corrective mechanism was decreasing. Earlier conflicts had often produced clearer outcomes with lower total costs. Later wars generated ambiguous results at devastating expense. This trend implied that societies could no longer rely on warfare to periodically reset accumulated problems. Alternative mechanisms were needed, but none were evident. Economic crises served similar functions but with different characteristics. Overextension eventually led to debt crises, currency debasements, or trade disruptions that forced contraction. These economic collapses could be devastating in immediate human terms but rarely destroyed infrastructure or knowledge. Recovery was often faster than after military defeat. However, economic crises tended to consolidate wealth in hands of those positioned to buy distressed assets, potentially increasing inequality and social tension. Environmental degradation operated on even longer timescales, but with more persistent effect. Deforestation, soil erosion, water depletion, these processes accumulated gradually but their consequences endured. Agricultural productivity declined slowly enough that each generation experienced only slightly worse conditions than their parents, but across centuries, the cumulative effect was substantial. Regions that had supported dense populations became marginal. Cities dependent on stressed hinterlands declined or relocated. The interaction between these different forms of crisis created complex dynamics. Economic stress could trigger warfare. As military conflicts could accelerate environmental damage. Environmental degradation undermined economic capacity, which weakened military power. The societies faced multiple simultaneous challenges rather than isolated problems, and the challenges reinforced each other in feedback loops that were difficult to interrupt, yet life continued. People adapted to changing circumstances. Populations migrated toward better conditions. Technologies improved efficiency. New resources were discovered. Trade networks rerouted around disruptions. Human resilience and creativity allowed civilization to persist through conditions that retrospectively appeared unsustainable. This resilience was real and admirable, but it also enabled dysfunction to continue longer than might otherwise have been possible. The question hanging over this entire period was whether humanity was learning from its experiences. Were the lessons from Bronze Age catastrophe being remembered and applied? Were new problems being recognized and addressed before they became crises? Or was each generation simply adapting to immediate pressures without understanding longer-term trajectories? The evidence was mixed. Some societies showed remarkable capacity for institutional learning, developing legal systems and governance structures that lasted centuries. Others repeated obvious mistakes, following patterns that had already failed elsewhere. No clear trend toward either wisdom or folly dominated. Humanity as a whole appeared to muddle through, neither catastrophically collapsing nor achieving stable sustainability. This muddling through characterized much of recorded history. Civilizations rose and fell, but human civilization persisted. Knowledge accumulated despite periodic losses. Technologies advanced despite setbacks. Populations grew despite wars and diseases. The overall trend appeared positive, even as specific instances were frequently tragic, but trends visible across millennia could obscure dangers operating at shorter timescales. The fact that humanity had survived thus far did not guarantee continued survival. Each new capability introduced new risks. Each increase in scale multiplied potential consequences. The past was not necessarily a reliable guide to the future when conditions changed qualitatively rather than merely quantitatively. The ancient catastrophe at the cities of the plain represented such a qualitative threshold. Destruction that permanent damaged environment was different in kind from conquest or even massacre. It established that certain actions could foreclose futures entirely, not just for losers but for everyone. That lesson remained relevant as human capabilities continued expanding. By the classical period, Greece and Rome at their heights, humanity had regained and in some ways exceeded Bronze Age civilization's complexity and reach. The Mediterranean world was integrated economically and culturally to unprecedented degree. Knowledge had accumulated, technologies had advanced, populations had grown. By most metrics, progress was real and substantial. Yet vulnerabilities had accumulated as well. The Roman Empire at its peak depended on grain shipments from Egypt, feeding Rome's massive population. It required continuous military campaigns, maintaining borders and suppressing revolts. It needed elaborate administrative apparatus coordinating activities across millions of square miles. It had created a system so large and complex that no one fully understood it, much less controlled it completely. This complexity created fragility masked by competent management. As long as the system operated normally, its interconnections appeared as strengths enabling specialization. But when disruptions occurred, those same interconnections transmitted shocks throughout the system. A harvest failure in Egypt could trigger food riots in Rome. A military defeat on one frontier could embolden challenges elsewhere. Economic crisis in one province could cascade through trade networks. The Roman response to these vulnerabilities was to intensify the approaches that had created them. More centralization, not less. More military power, not alternative security mechanisms. More extraction from provinces, not sustainable resource management. This response was not irrational given incentive structures and available options, but it increased systemic fragility even as it appeared to address immediate problems. Eventually, the accumulated stresses exceeded the system's capacity to absorb them. Not through a single catastrophic event, but through cascading failures that overwhelmed response capabilities. Barbarian invasions, economic contraction, political instability, disease outbreaks, each manageable individually, became overwhelming collectively. The Western Roman Empire didn't fall suddenly but gradually dissolved as central authority became unable to maintain control over distant provinces. The fall of Rome has been analyzed exhaustively, with scholars identifying multiple contributing factors: climate change, lead poisoning, moral decay, barbarian pressure, economic dysfunction, political instability and disability, all played roles. But underlying all specific causes was structural fragility created by excessive complexity and scale. The system had grown beyond capacity to govern itself effectively. Once it began failing, there were no mechanisms to gracefully simplify or contract. The post-Roman period resembled in some ways the post-Bronze Age catastrophe recovery centuries earlier. Complexity decreased. Populations fell. Trade networks contracted. Literacy declined. Material culture simplified. Historians labeled it a dark age, emphasizing loss rather than adaptation. But from another perspective, it was necessary correction and adjustment to scales that available technologies and institutions could actually sustain. This cyclical pattern, rise, overextension, collapse, recovery, rise again, appeared repeatedly across different civilizations. China experienced it multiple times. India went through similar cycles. The Islamic world rose, expanded, fragmented. The pattern suggested something fundamental about how human societies operated at scale. They could not maintain steady states but oscillated between centralization and fragmentation, expansion and contraction. Understanding this pattern should have provided wisdom for avoiding future repetitions. If societies could recognize when they were approaching overextension, they might contract deliberately before collapse became inevitable. If the signs of fragility could be identified early, interventions might be possible. If the lessons from past collapses were studied carefully, perhaps futures could be different, but such learning faced immense obstacles. Leaders whose power derived from expansion had little incentive to advocate contraction. Populations that had internalized growth as normal resisted limits. Institutions designed for one scale could not easily adapt to another. The knowledge of past cycles existed, but translating it into present action required overcoming structural impediments that benefited from ignorance, so the cycles continued, new empires rose and fell. Technologies advanced and were lost and rediscovered. Knowledge accumulated in some domains while regressing in others. Human civilization persisted, but in patterns that appeared from sufficient distance to be almost mechanical, predictable oscillations driven by fundamental dynamics rather than conscious choice. This raised profound questions about agency and inevitability. Were humans genuinely directing civilizational trajectories, or merely responding to forces beyond control? Could wisdom interrupt cycles, or merely influence how they played out? Was learning from history actually possible, or did each age insist on its own unique version of common mistakes? The ancient catastrophe at the cities of the plain offered no definitive answers, but it provided a reference point. It showed that trajectories could be interrupted suddenly and permanently. It demonstrated that consequences could exceed intentions dramatically. It established that some outcomes were irreversible regardless of regret. Other lessons were these remained relevant truths regardless of historical period or technological sophistication. As centuries accumulated and humanity entered what would later be called modernity, the ancient catastrophe remained present in cultural memory but increasingly abstracted. The specific events were buried under layers of theological interpretation. The mechanisms were completely obscured. What remained was generalized sense that boundaries existed, and overreach was dangerous and catastrophe was possible. This diffuse awareness provided some protection but decreasing amounts as confidence grew. The modern world believed itself fundamentally different from ancient civilizations. It possessed science rather than superstition, rationality rather than myth, evidence-based decision-making rather than traditional authority. These beliefs were partly justified. Modernity did represent genuine advances in methodology and understanding, but the beliefs also created blind spots. Modern confidence dismissed ancient warnings as primitive rather than considering whether they encoded lessons that remained relevant. Scientific method was powerful for understanding specific mechanisms, but struggled with complex systems characterized by emergence and irreducible uncertainty. Rationality could optimize within parameters but had difficulty questioning whether parameters themselves were appropriate. Most fundamentally, modernity created capabilities that exceeded wisdom's pace of development. Technologies advanced faster than ethical frameworks could adapt. Social organization grew more complex than governance structures could effectively manage. Knowledge accumulated faster than education could transmit it. The gap between what could be done and what should be done widened continuously. This gap resembled the one that had existed before the ancient catastrophe. Then as now, impressive capabilities coexisted with limited understanding of consequences. Then as now, short-term incentives drove behavior despite long-term risks. Then as now, warnings existed, but were diluted by competing messages and institutional inertia. The specifics differed, but the structure was strikingly similar. The question facing modernity was whether it could learn from this pattern without repeating it. Could humanity recognize dangerous trajectories before reaching catastrophic endpoints? Could restraint be chosen consciously rather than imposed through disaster? Could wisdom catch up to capability before the gap produced irreversible consequences? These questions had no predetermined answers. The future remained genuinely open, shaped by choices not yet made. But the past provided context. It showed what happened when similar questions were answered through neglect rather than engagement. It demonstrated the costs of assuming that intelligence alone provided sufficient protection against self-inflicted catastrophe. The ancient cities of the plain stood, or rather, failed to stand as testament to those costs. The land there still would not sustain life fully despite thousands of years for recovery. The salt deposits still poisoned soil. The ruins still marked where complexity had collapsed into silence. These physical facts transcended interpretation. They were arguments that required no language, lessons carved into geography itself. Whether modernity would heed those lessons or insist on learning them again through experience remained uncertain. The only certainty was that the lessons remained available, waiting in landscapes that remembered what cultures forgot, preserved in warnings that each age had to choose whether to honor or dismiss. The ancient catastrophe was not prophecy but precedent. What humanity made of that precedent would determine whether it remained history or became prologue. The silence that followed Rome's dissolution stretched across centuries, and in that silence something subtle occurred. The catastrophe that had destroyed the Bronze Age cities became so distant that even its mythological form began to fade from urgent consideration. What remained were fragments, biblical passages read in churches, clay tablets buried in desert sand, place names that no longer connected to living memory. The lesson had been encoded carefully by traumatized ancestors, transmitted faithfully through generations of scribes and storytellers, but now it reached populations for whom catastrophe was abstraction rather than possibility. Medieval Europe inherited these texts but read them through entirely different lenses. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah became a morality tale about sexual transgression rather than a warning about concentrated power's capacity to render land permanently uninhabitable. The story of Lot's wife became an object lesson about obedience to divine command rather than an accurate description of what happens to human tissue exposed to certain types of radiation or chemical fallout. The theological interpretation wasn't wrong exactly, but it was incomplete. It preserved the story while losing the technical content that might have made the warning functionally useful. This transformation happened gradually, almost invisibly. Each generation of monks copying manuscripts made small changes, clarifying ambiguous passages, harmonizing contradictions, emphasizing moral lessons over descriptive details. The work was done with reverence and care. No one intended to obscure ancient knowledge, but intention doesn't determine outcome. The accumulated effect of centuries of well-meaning interpretation was to distance the accounts from their physical reference. What had been eyewitness testimony to technological catastrophe became sacred literature about divine judgment. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, scholars worked with some of the same ancient texts plus others that had survived in different manuscript traditions. They too interpreted through theological frameworks, but they maintained stronger emphasis on careful preservation of original language and attention to material details. Islamic science flourished during Europe's medieval period partly because it maintained more direct connection to ancient knowledge, including uncomfortable knowledge about how civilizations could fail catastrophically through their own actions. Yet even Islamic scholars struggled with texts describing destruction on scales that seemed impossible. How could fire fall from heaven in ways that left Earth poisoned for generations? How could entire cities vanish so completely that even their locations became uncertain? The accounts demanded either acceptance of miraculous intervention or recognition that ancient peoples had possessed capabilities beyond what medieval civilizations could achieve. Neither option was comfortable. Some scholars chose a third path, treating the accounts as allegorical rather than historical. This protected both faith and reason by suggesting the stories taught spiritual truths without requiring belief in literal events. This interpretation gained influence because it resolved tensions elegantly. You could honor the texts without confronting their implications. You could maintain tradition without grappling with what it might mean if the events described had actually occurred as described. This allegorical reading allowed medieval civilization to function without paralyzing fear of repeating ancient mistakes. Life could proceed normally under the assumption that the old catastrophes were unique events unlikely to recur. This assumption enabled the gradual rebuilding of complexity, the slow accumulation of knowledge and capability, the patient reconstruction of systems that approached the scale and sophistication of what had come before. Trade networks re-established themselves across Eurasia, following routes that had lain dormant or reduced for centuries. Cities grew again to sizes that required elaborate coordination of food supply and waste removal. Agricultural techniques improved through slow experimentation and exchange of knowledge between regions. Metalworking advanced. Architecture became more ambitious. The world was recovering, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. The Crusades represented a threshold in this process. For the first time since Rome's fall, European powers organized military campaigns on continental scale. The logistics were immense, moving thousands of soldiers across thousands of miles, supplying them, coordinating multiple kingdoms toward common objectives. Sophists failed in their stated goals, but succeeded in demonstrating that large-scale coordination was again possible. They rebuilt institutional capacity and confidence that had been lost. This renewed capability spread beyond military domains. The same organizational techniques that managed crusading armies could be applied to trade, governance, and construction. Cathedrals rose across Europe, each one a demonstration project in complex coordination and resource management. Universities formed, systematizing education and knowledge transmission. Guilds organized craft production with standards and apprenticeship systems. Medieval Europe was creating infrastructure for operating at scales that had not been attempted since antiquity. The Black Death interrupted this trajectory catastrophically. Plague swept through populations that had grown dense enough to support rapid disease transmission. Somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population died within a few years. The catastrophe was sudden, devastating, and seemingly random. Entire villages were abandoned, economic systems collapsed, social order frayed. Those who survived were traumatized in ways that shaped behavior for generations. Yet the plague was also instructive. It demonstrated that catastrophe could still strike despite centuries of stability. It showed that complexity could amplify disaster. Densely packed cities and far-reaching trade networks enable disease to spread farther and faster than would have been possible in simpler times. It forced recognition that progress did not equal safety, that capability did not ensure security. The medieval world received a visceral reminder of vulnerability. The response was complex and contradictory. Some communities became more cautious, implementing quarantine procedures and public health measures. Others became more fatalistic, concluding that disaster would strike regardless of precautions. Religious interpretations varied. Some saw divine punishment requiring repentance. Others saw random misfortune requiring stoic acceptance. No consensus emerged about what the plague meant or how future catastrophes might be prevented. What did emerge was renewed interest in ancient knowledge, including knowledge that had been lost or ignored. If old texts contained wisdom that might prevent future plagues, perhaps other useful knowledge remained buried in ancient writings. This helped motivate what became the Renaissance, a conscious effort to recover and build upon classical learning. The movement was cultural and artistic, but also scientific and technological. It represented belief that the ancients had understood things worth recovering. Renaissance scholars found the ancient texts frustrating in certain ways. The accounts of great achievements were often vague on technical details. Descriptions of advanced technologies were ambiguous or seemingly exaggerated. References to capabilities that seemed impossible were common. Some scholars dismissed these as errors or mythological embellishments. Others wondered whether the ancients had genuinely possessed capabilities that later ages had lost. This tension became more acute as Renaissance technology began to approach or exceed certain ancient achievements. When construction techniques advanced enough to build structures comparable to Roman engineering, it became clear the ancients had not been exaggerating their capabilities in that domain. Perhaps they had not been exaggerating in others either. Perhaps the accounts of ancient catastrophes should be taken more literally than medieval theology had suggested. The printing press transformed how knowledge circulated. Texts that had existed in only a few manuscript copies could now be printed in thousands. This democratized access but also standardized interpretations. Once a particular translation or edition became widely distributed, it shaped how subsequent readers understood the material. The printed version gained authority over earlier manuscript traditions, even when manuscripts preserved details that printing omitted. Biblical accounts of the destroyed cities spread in standardized printed form throughout Europe. Millions of readers encountered essentially identical text, reinforcing particular interpretations. The theological reading divine judgment on wickedness became dominant, not because it was necessarily most accurate, but because it was most widely printed and preached. Alternative readings existed but lacked the distribution mechanism to compete effectively. Meanwhile, archaeological interest in ancient sites gradually increased. Travelers to the Middle East reported ruins and strange landscapes. The Dead Sea's unusual properties were documented and studied. Attempts were made to locate the destroyed cities based on biblical geography. These investigations were limited by technology and often hampered by local conditions. but they established that the text referred to real places where unusual events had occurred. Soil samples from the Dead Sea region showed the anomalously high salt content that ancient texts described. The land truly was sterile in ways that natural processes alone could not easily explain. Water sources were indeed bitter with mineral content. The descriptions in ancient texts, when checked against physical reality, proved remarkably accurate in their material claims, even if theological interpretations remained debatable. This created tension between scientific and religious authorities. If the physical descriptions were accurate, perhaps other details should be taken seriously as well. Perhaps the scale of destruction described was real. Perhaps the mechanisms hinted at in ancient texts deserved investigation rather than dismissal. But such investigation threatened to undermine theological frameworks that had been built on assuming the events were fundamentally miraculous. Rather than technological, the scientific revolution proceeded carefully around these tensions. Galileo, Newton, and their contemporaries focused on celestial mechanics and mathematics domains that could be studied without directly challenging sacred narratives. But the methodology they developed, observation, hypothesis testing, revision, was fundamentally corrosive to authority based on tradition alone. Once scientific method proved successful in astronomy and physics, its application to other domains became inevitable. Geology emerged as a science that had to grapple with catastrophic events. The rock layers clearly showed that violent disruptions had occurred in Earth's past. The question was whether these were gradual processes operating over immense time or sudden catastrophes of the type described in ancient texts. Early geologists were often catastrophists, seeing evidence of floods and upheavals. Later gradualists argued that slow processes could explain most features without invoking disasters. This debate had implications beyond geology. If Earth's history was primarily gradual, then ancient catastrophe accounts were probably exaggerated. If catastrophic events had genuinely occurred, then perhaps ancient texts should be read more literally. The scientific evidence was ambiguous enough that both positions could find support, so ideology and prior belief often determined which interpretation scientists preferred. The Enlightenment brought renewed confidence in human reason and progress. The dominant narrative became one of steady advancement from primitive superstition toward rational understanding. Ancient peoples were assumed to have been less capable, their accounts less reliable. Modern civilization believed itself fundamentally superior, not just in technology, but in reasoning capacity. This created skepticism toward ancient warnings because those warnings came from supposedly inferior minds. Yet the Enlightenment also produced careful scholarship that took ancient texts seriously as historical documents. Scholars learned ancient languages, compared manuscript traditions, tried to distinguish historical cause from legendary embellishments. This work revealed that many ancient accounts were far more sophisticated than condescending attitudes assumed. The texts showed careful observation and logical reasoning applied to phenomena that observers lacked vocabulary to explain. The recovered Sumerian texts presented particular challenges. They described events and beings that seemed impossible but did so with bureaucratic matter-of-factness that was hard to dismiss as pure fantasy. The accounts read like administrative records, dry, detailed, specific. This was not the style of mythology or religious scripture. It was documentation of events treated as real and important enough to record permanently in clay. How should such texts be interpreted? Were the Anunnaki gods myths or something else? Were the wars described between cities or between beings with capabilities that exceeded human norms? Were the weapons that poisoned land conventional warfare or something more dangerous? The texts provided no clear answers, but they forced questions that made both religious and scientific authorities uncomfortable. Industrial Revolution added new dimension to these questions. As human capabilities expanded dramatically, previously impossible-seeming accounts became less impossible. When factories could produce goods at scales that would have seemed miraculous centuries earlier, when railways could move armies faster than any ancient force, when telegraphs enabled instant communication across continents, the gap between modern and ancient capabilities shrank in imagination. More disturbingly, industrial civilization began producing its own environmental catastrophes. Rivers became dead from chemical pollution. Air in manufacturing cities became unsafe to breathe. Landscapes were stripped bare by mining. These effects were local and limited at first, but they demonstrated that human activity could poison environments in ways that persisted. The ancient accounts of lands rendered uninhabitable no longer seemed entirely beyond possibility. The American Civil War introduced industrialized warfare, railways, moving troops, mass-produced weapons, telegraph-coordinated strategy. The scale of destruction exceeded anything in previous American experience. A nation that had known only relatively small wars suddenly faced conflict that killed hundreds of thousands and devastated entire regions. The experience provided a glimpse of what organized violence could achieve with industrial capability. Europeans observed this with a mix of fascination and unease. Would future European wars follow similar patterns? Would industrial capability applied to military ends produce unprecedented destruction? The Franco-Prussian War provided partial answer. Modern weapons and organization made warfare more lethal. The casualties mounted faster. The destruction was more complete. Victory came quicker, but at higher cost. Still, these conflicts remained limited compared to ancient accounts. Cities were damaged but not erased. Land was fought over but remained habitable afterward. The destruction was terrible for those experiencing it, but reversible over years or decades. Nothing approached the permanent environmental damage described in ancient texts. The modern world had not yet matched ancient catastrophe in that dimension. Chemistry advanced during the 19th century, revealing how materials could be transformed and combined in ways that created entirely new substances. Some of these substances were extraordinarily useful: dyes, medicines, fertilizers. Others were dangerous explosives, poisons, acids. The line between beneficial and destructive was not always clear. A substance useful in one context could be catastrophic in another. Alfred Nobel's invention of dynamite exemplified this ambiguity. The explosive was intended for construction, mining, tunneling, clearing land. It enabled projects that would have been impossibly difficult with earlier technology. But it was also a weapon, more powerful than gunpowder, capable of destruction beyond what individual soldiers could previously achieve. Nobel later regretted the military applications and established prizes rewarding peace and science. But the invention could not be uninvented. The late 19th century saw increasing scientific interest in energy, its forms, transformations, and potential applications. Physicists discovered that matter contained energy in quantities that seemed impossible. The equations suggested that tiny amounts of matter could, in principle, release enormous energy if the right conditions could be achieved. This remained theoretical. No one knew how to actually release that energy, but the mathematics were clear. Radioactivity's discovery added urgency to these questions. Materials existed that released energy continuously through processes that seemed to violate ordinary understanding. The energy came from within atoms themselves. This suggested that atoms were not indivisible fundamental units, but complex structures with internal dynamics. If those dynamics could be understood and controlled, perhaps the theoretical energy release could become practical. World War I demonstrated that industrialized civilization applied to warfare produced catastrophe on unprecedented scale. The trenches, the artillery barrages, the poison gas. Millions died in conditions that soldiers compared to hell. Entire regions were devastated. The land was cratered, poisoned with chemicals, rendered temporarily unsuitable for habitation. Modern war had approached but not quite reached the scale of ancient catastrophe described in texts. The poison gas was particularly disturbing because it resembled the evil wind described in Sumerian texts, invisible but deadly, drifting with wind currents, causing slow, agonizing death for those exposed, rendering areas temporarily uninhabitable. The mechanisms differed, but the phenomenon was strikingly similar. For the first time, soldiers experienced something like what ancient texts described: contamination that could not be seen but killed reliably. The war ended with millions dead and empires collapsed. European civilization, which had believed itself at the peak of progress, discovered it was capable of self-inflicted wounds of catastrophic scale. The confidence that had built through the 19th century shattered. The post-war period was marked by disillusionment and questioning. Progress did not automatically lead to improvement. Capability did not equal wisdom. Power could destroy its wielders, yet the lessons remained partial. The war was terrible, but civilization survived. Europe recovered economically within years. Populations were traumatized but adapted. The dominant interpretation became that the war had been an aberration, a mistake to avoid repeating, but not an indication that industrial civilization was fundamentally dangerous. With proper international organization and diplomacy, future wars could be prevented, or at least limited. Physics continued advancing toward the theoretical capability of releasing atomic energy. Einstein's equations clarified the relationship between mass and energy. Experiments with radioactive materials revealed more about atomic structure. By the 1930s, the possibility of chain reactions releasing large amounts of energy from small amounts of material moved from speculation to serious scientific investigation. Multiple research groups worldwide pursued these questions. The discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 made clear that atomic energy release was not just theoretically possible but practically achievable. The energy released from splitting uranium atoms was measurable and substantial. More importantly, the process could potentially be self-sustaining, each split atom releasing neutrons that split additional atoms in a chain reaction. If such a reaction could be controlled, it might power generators. If it could not be controlled, it would explode. World War II created urgency around these questions. Multiple nations recognized that atomic energy could be weaponized. The race began to develop such weapons before enemies could. The Manhattan Project mobilized unprecedented resources and scientific talent toward creating atomic bombs. The technical challenges were immense, but the theoretical foundation was solid. It was a question of engineering, not possibility. When the first atomic device detonated in the New Mexico desert in July 1945, witnesses reported effects that eerily matched ancient descriptions. The flash of light brighter than the sun, the heat that arrived instantaneously, the mushroom cloud rising miles into the sky, the blast wave that flattened structures miles away, and afterward the lingering radiation that made the site dangerous to approach. The test confirmed that humans had recreated the capability for catastrophic destruction that ancient texts described. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated the effects on cities. Total destruction at ground zero. Fires spreading for miles. Tens of thousands dead instantly. More dying slowly from radiation exposure in the following weeks and months. The land contaminated with fallout that would persist for years. Buildings reduced to shadows. Survivors describing a hell that exceeded language to convey. Robert Oppenheimer, witnessing the first test, recalled the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The Hindu text described divine beings with weapons that could annihilate armies and cities. For centuries, these descriptions had seemed mythological. Now they appeared disturbingly literal. The ancients had described precisely what Oppenheimer had just helped create: power to destroy on civilizational scale. Humanity had arrived at a threshold. For the first time in recorded history, we possessed verified capability to render large areas permanently uninhabitable through deliberate action. The effects matched ancient accounts with uncomfortable precision: flash, heat, blast, fallout, dead land. The mechanism differed: fission weapons versus whatever the ancients had used, but the outcome was identical. The ancient catastrophe was no longer ancient. It was contemporary and repeatable. This realization produced different responses in different quarters. Some argued that possession of such weapons would prevent their use, that mutual assured destruction would deter warfare between nuclear powers. This became the doctrine of deterrence, assuming that rational actors would not employ weapons that guaranteed their own annihilation. The logic was impeccable provided all actors remained rational and controlled their weapons perfectly. Others warned that the weapons were too dangerous to exist at all. They should be abolished, banned, eliminated. Treaties should be negotiated, prohibiting their development and use. International organizations should monitor compliance and enforce restrictions. Humanity should collectively step back from the threshold it had reached. The weapons should be uninvented through agreement, but capability cannot be uninvented. Once knowledge exists, it persists. Once weapons are built, they remain. The nuclear powers multiplied from 2 to 5 to eventually 9 known states with nuclear capability. The arsenals expanded from tens to thousands to tens of thousands of warheads. The destructive potential grew to levels that could end most complex life on Earth. Deterrence held through mixture of luck, careful management, and several near misses that remained classified for decades. The Cold War period normalized living under threat of annihilation. Populations adapted psychologically to knowledge that their cities could be destroyed within hours. Children were taught to duck and cover as though that would protect them from nuclear blast. Fallout shelters were built and stocked. Civil defense plans were drawn up knowing they would be largely futile. Society functioned despite existential threat because the alternative paralyzing fear was psychologically unsustainable. This normalization was dangerous because it reduced urgency around prevention. If civilization could continue despite nuclear arsenals, then perhaps the arsenals were tolerable. If decades passed without their use, then perhaps they would never be used. The lesson from ancient catastrophe that such events do occur faded as modern catastrophe was successfully avoided year after year. Successful deterrence was mistaken for permanent safety. Meanwhile, archaeology continued uncovering evidence from ancient sites. Tal el-Hammam excavations revealed destruction consistent with high-energy airburst. The material evidence matched both ancient descriptions and modern weapons effects. The catastrophe described in texts had physical basis in reality. Geologists found similar evidence in other locations where ancient texts described catastrophic destruction. Patterns of vitrified material, unusual isotope ratios, abrupt civilization collapse. The evidence accumulated without producing consensus interpretation. Some scholars maintained natural explanations, meteor impacts, volcanic events, earthquakes. Others argued that ancient civilizations might have possessed advanced capabilities. The debate continued because evidence was suggestive rather than conclusive. What became clear was that the ancient accounts were not entirely mythological. Something had happened at the places and times described. Cities had been destroyed suddenly and completely. Land had been rendered sterile for centuries. Populations had fled and never returned. These were historical facts, whatever their cause. The texts describing these events were therefore historical documents deserving serious attention rather than dismissal as primitive superstition. This archaeological validation arrived precisely when humanity possessed capability to repeat the catastrophe. Just as modern nuclear weapons made ancient descriptions believable, ancient descriptions suggested that such catastrophes were possible and had occurred before. The past and present illuminated each other uncomfortably. We had not pioneered a new form of destruction, we had rediscovered an old one. The question was whether we could learn from the pattern without completing it. Ancient civilizations had developed catastrophic capability and employed it with consequences that echoed across millennia. Modern civilization had developed equivalent capability. Would we employ it with equivalent consequences? Or could we recognize the trajectory in time to choose differently? The answer remained genuinely uncertain. Nuclear weapons had not been used in warfare since 1945, a remarkable achievement given Cold War tensions. But they had not been eliminated either. They remained ready for use, maintained at enormous cost, justified through deterrence logic that assumed perpetual rationality. The situation was stable, but the stability rested on assumptions that might not hold indefinitely. Other threats emerged that resembled ancient patterns in different ways. Climate change from accumulated greenhouse gases, environmental degradation from industrial waste, ecosystem collapse from habitat destruction. These were slower than nuclear war but potentially as catastrophic in ultimate effect, and unlike nuclear weapons they were not prevented by deterrence. They resulted from ordinary activity aggregated across billions of people. The ancient catastrophe warned about both types of threat. The sudden destruction of cities showed what concentrated power could do. The permanent poisoning of land showed what happened when environmental carrying capacity was exceeded. Modern civilization faced both dangers simultaneously, the acute threat of nuclear war and the chronic threat of ecological collapse. Ancient precedent suggested neither should be assumed impossible, so we reached the present moment, standing where ancient memory and modern capability intersect. The texts that survived from Bronze Age catastrophe encode warning about what can happen when power exceeds wisdom. The physical evidence from ancient sites confirms that such events occurred. The modern arsenal demonstrates that we have recreated the capability. The pattern is complete except for its final act. Whether that act will be completion through repetition or interruption through recognition remains undecided. We possess advantages the ancients lacked: better historical record, scientific understanding, global communication, but we also face pressures they didn't: larger populations, more complex systems, faster pace of change. The balance of factors does not clearly favor either outcome. What is certain is that the choice exists. We are not passengers watching inevitability unfold, but participants whose decisions matter. The ancient catastrophe offers guidance not as prophecy but as precedent. It shows what happened when similar conditions existed. It suggests what might happen if we follow parallel trajectories. But it does not determine what will happen. that depends on choices still being made. The land near the Dead Sea continues its quiet testimony. The salt remains. The ruins stand. The earth remembers what humans keep partially forgetting. These physical facts anchor the warning beyond interpretation's reach. No theology or ideology can make that land fertile again. No narrative can erase its history. The scar tissue of ancient catastrophe persists as permanent reminder of what concentrated power can do.